Hey guys, how are you all? Welcome to Let's Start Story on What If Ginny Saved by Harry and Love Each Other. So do 4 blue hearts. Comment, be sure to subscribe to our channel and like this video, and please share with your friends and watch till end. Also check out Patreon for I have upload Harry x Hermione uncensored spicy version, link in description. 1. When she was little, she told her father she was going to marry Harry Potter. Her dad told her, gently, that really wasn't likely. To be fair, he did point out that if she ever did actually meet Harry, he was sure to fall in love with her, but she told him that she didn't care if she had to brew a love potion, she would marry him. In her 3rd year she seriously considered it. She even got the book. It was the happiest day of her life when she realized she didn't need it. 2. The worst year at Hogwarts was her 1st year. Because it was hard enough to leave her family behind despite her assurances that she would be having too much fun to miss them, to be on her own, for the first time. But to go through all that, and then to be possessed by the most feared, the most evil dark wizard of all. To have poured out her thoughts and her feelings into that diary, to delight in having a friend, someone who seemed to have understood what she was going through, only to realize that everything he had told her was a lie. That he was mocking her, and her foolishness. She never got over that, never. Because it truly was one of the worst things that happened to her, coming second only to the death of Fred. Because she had gotten rid of Tom, she had gotten over it, she had lived through it. But Fred would never live again. He was her brother, and she would never see him again. And that hurt worse than what the diary had done. After that year, her worst year had been her 4th. Not only because of Umbridge, and all the terrible things that she had gone through, but because that was the year her dad had been attacked by the snake. She could remember sitting there, terrified that her dad wouldn't make it. That was the first time she fully realized what they were all going through, what Voldemort was doing. That was the first time she realized that at the end of it all, they might not be one big happy family, but just a mixture of broken pieces. 3. Even though she would never admit it to anyone, not only the fact that she had favorites, but that it was him, but Ron was her favorite brother, even though he was so infuriating and the one she fought with the most. He's our favorite because of all those times he barged in on her and Harry, acting like it was a mistake. Because she knows that even though Harry is his best friend, if he ever hurt her, Ron would hex him into oblivion, before any of the others. 4. The day before Fred's funeral, she went into his old room and just broke down. She sat in the middle of the floor and just sobbed, hard, her body shaking uncontrollably as she hugged herself. She was surprised no one came, but then again crying was common in her house those days. Then, opening a drawer in her desperate search for something to blow her nose with, she found a treat. And then something clicked in her brain. She didn't eat the canary cream, though, afraid by some cruel trick of fate she would be stuck as a giant bird for Fred's funeral. 5. Then she pictured that scene. And almost did. 6. Instead, she wore bright yellow robes to the funeral the next day. Almost everyone gave her a look, whether stunned, dirty, or pity-filled. Everyone except George, who looked at her and burst out laughing, and it had been so long since she had heard anyone laugh, let alone George, before promptly changing his robes to a very blinding shade of pink. Then Angelina turned hers bright green, and then Percy, orange. Soon everyone was wearing bright vibrant robes, and Bill even bewitched his to flash different colors. 7. But the best part was when George hugged her so tightly. Her bones almost broke, and then whispered, "Thank you," in her ear. 8. She didn't want to name her children after dead people. The way she thought about it, it would be hard enough living up to the name Potter, but name them after great war heroes. But one look in Harry's eyes told her that he needed this. Besides, she reasoned with herself, it's not the name that made the person, it's the person who made the name. 9. She had always doted on Teddy. Because really, he had been the first child born in the family, even if, technically, he wasn't family by blood. But in every other essence. Teddy Lupin was a Weasley, a Potter. He was a part of their family. And she loved him, so much so she was terrified that when she had her own children, one of two things would happen. 1. That she would be so taken by her own children, and Teddy would be pushed to the side, or 2, that she would constantly compare her children to Teddy, and she was terrified that they wouldn't live up to him. Neither thing happened, though. Her kids came first, of course, always, and she loved them more than anything. But Teddy wasn't pushed to the side, not at all. He always had a place in her heart. And eventually she realized that Teddy didn't need a parent, didn't need someone trying to take the place of his own mother and father, in which no one could ever succeed. What he needed was some stability. And so Ginny provided. Eventually she began to think of him less and less as a lost little boy who needed support, and more as a friend, proven when he came to her first and confessed his feelings for Victoire. And she told him that it was okay, because she wasn't his cousin, and that just because she was 2 years his junior, it really shouldn't mean anything. 10. She wouldn't help but be upset when she found out Albus was in Slytherin, of course she would be. She had been brought up her whole life taught that Slytherin was a terrible house, a terrible place to be, that it only produced dark wizards. Even when Harry told her that he was proud of him and his choice, she was a little confused at that part. She couldn't help but resent the hat for putting him there. She had always pictured a happy Gryffindor family, and the fact that that wasn't going to happen deflated her a bit. But then Rose got sorted into Ravenclaw, and Lily into Hufflepuff, and she had too. Except that that wasn't going to happen. Eventually, she got over it, and was happy, at least, to see that there wasn't as much house division as had been before. And it wasn't as if anything had changed. Albus came home his regular self. Not with books loaded with dark arts and an evil glint in his eye as she had been afraid he might have. Really, the only thing he did bring home wasn't a thing at all, but a person Scorpius Malfoy. And she didn't feel too bad about that after Rose did that same thing, in much different circumstances, mind you. But even after her acceptance, she still can't help but be proud that James was a Gryffindor, at least. In the beginning, she didn't believe in her dad's stories. Because they just seemed too far-fetched, too amazing and bewildering to be real. And besides, whenever he would tell a story her mother would simply give her a look and then smile at him, and Luna took that to mean that the stories weren't real, that her father was just an amazing storyteller. It never really occurred to her that her dad might actually believe in them. She just thought they were stories. Then her mom died, and suddenly she needed something, anything, to grab a hold of, to snatch. To keep her afloat. And her dad's stories were there, in front of her, like a lifeboat. So she grabbed hold, taking the crumple-horned Snarkack by the horns and holding on for her life, because here were these stories, that had nothing to do with the fact that her mother had just died, and she put her hope into them, praying that they might prove to be real, that they might take her away from the grief that was piling up in her chest. And then, after pretending to believe for so long, she did. When she first saw the Thestrals, she held a grudge against them. Because the only reason she could see them was because she could no longer see her mother, and she hated that something so beautiful, yes, she found them beautiful, graceful, elegant. Had it been any other situation she would have loved them at first sight, could come from something so ugly, so disastrous. And then she learned to forgive the Thestrals, because really, it wasn't their fault, was it? Blammin'. The Thestrals for her mother's death wouldn't fix anything, and it was just plain cruel to them. 3. She has good instincts about people. Like, for instance, Ron Weasley. She could sense right away he was in love with Hermione Granger, even if he hadn't realized it yet. For Luna's part, she never really did understand why, because she didn't understand what could make a person who spent her days with her head buried in her books attractive. And maybe she was a little jealous. But that really didn't matter. She knew the same about Harry Potter. Not that he was in love with Hermione Granger, but that he would be victorious. She knew in her heart that he would save them all, because she could sense it, that he had potential, and she trusted him. Even when she saw him hanging limp in Hagrid's arms, she refused to believe it. Because she couldn't be wrong. Not because she was arrogant, but because if Harry Potter wasn't there to save them, then who would? She couldn't be wrong. For the sake of humanity. She could not be wrong. 4. She was mad at her dad, furious, when she found out what he had done. That was saying a lot, because she rarely ever got mad. She simply didn't see the point of releasing such negative energy. But when she found out that he was ready to betray Harry Potter, despite everything she had ever told him, even through all of the things he had written about him, she was angry. She just couldn't believe he would go against the side he had claimed to support. That he would turn over the only chance of survival to you-know-who, that he would sacrifice so Ma. NY lives to save the life of his daughter. She then thought it over. And really, he couldn't be blamed. Because he didn't know what he was doing, due to grief and anxiety. Besides, he had already lost his wife. She could understand that he didn't want to lose his only daughter, too. 5. It never really bothered her that others ridiculed her, or that they hid her stuff. Because it was all just fun and games. Because those people weren't her friends. She didn't care what they thought, because really, why would she? She wouldn't let people who didn't know her affect her life. And maybe it took her a little longer than normal to find them, but she did get friends. And she loved them, because they were her friends. Maybe they thought her a little weird, but that was okay. She wasn't perfect, and nor were they. Hermione was too bookish, Harry too independent, Ron too sarcastic, always letting humor lead his life. But she never dwelled on those things, because they were her friends. And you don't let things like that get in the way of your friendships. 6. She always got along best with Neville. Because even though both her and Harry had lost a parent, in his case, both, Neville had lost his too. Maybe they weren't dead in the physical sense, but they were dead to Neville. Because at least Luna had spent time with her mother, at least she had known her, had known what it was like to be loved by her. But she couldn't imagine what it would be like to be so close to your parents, and yet so far away. She couldn't imagine the pain that would come from having your parents look at you with no realization. And one night, when they were up on the astronomy tower talking about this, Luna leaned in and kissed Neville. When she pulled away he smiled at her, and she smiled back, because it had been nice, comforting. Nothing had ever come of it, she knew nothing would, for it had been evident that neither had felt anything. But she still always felt a certain affection for Neville. Despite this, Ginny would always have a special place in her heart for that night in the hospital, after the birth of Lily, when she called her into the room and told her, with a big smile on her face and a little tiny girl with a mop of red hair already on her head, that she was looking at Lily Luna Potter, and then asked her if she would be her godmother. She of course said yes. 7. When she finally came to terms and accepted that some of her dad's mythical creatures, like the crumple-horned snurkak, didn't exist, it hurt a little bit. Because she had always trusted her father, and she had Alwa. YS believed in everything he had ever said. But then she found a numerous amount of other creatures even her father didn't know about, and she realized that it didn't matter whether some of the stories weren't true. Because the most important thing was that her father had given her this love and this fascination for the creatures she found and nurtured. And really, he had led her to her most important find of all, Rolf. 8. Lysander doesn't like his name, she knows, because a few days after he went to Hogwarts he wrote home telling her that everyone made fun of his name and his brother's name. And why on earth couldn't she have named them something normal, like Richard or Peter? Luna felt really bad after reading that letter, and when a letter came a few days later from Lorcan she expected the worst. But he simply said that he was having an amazing time, and that Hogwarts was just as magnificent as she had told him it was. He wrote saying that he and Lysander had reunited with Lily Potter, and that Luna was right. The slight age difference didn't mean anything, they were still as close as they had ever been. He told her that both he and his brother were in Ravenclaw as well, with Rose Weasley. He didn't mention anything about his name. But Luna still felt a bit guilty about it, for a while anyway. 9. Lysander only pretends to believe in her stories. She can tell, because say that's what she did for so many years. He smiles and goes along with what she says, what she tells him, even as Lorcan hangs on to her every word. But it's okay that he doesn't believe in them, she's okay with that. And if it took what Luna had gone through in order to believe in the stories, she hoped he never believed in them. 10. She had always harbored hopes that at least one of her children would fall for a Potter or a Weasley. She had always thought that it would be Lorcan and Lily, because they were closer friends and were around each other more than she was around Lysander. So she was surprised when Lysander tentatively told her that he had feelings for Lily Potter, but he was afraid, because she was older than him. Luna told him that that probably shouldn't matter, and when he came to her a few days later, telling her that he had kissed her and she had kissed him back, she was ecstatic. Because now her friends would become her family, if things worked out, of course, and nothing could be better than that. 1. He never ever blamed his dad for anything he ever did. When he sat Scorpius down the night before he went to Hogwarts and told him, well, everything, Scorpius had never admired him more. Because it had taken guts to tell his son, the one person who considered him nothing short of a god, that he wasn't perfect, that he had messed up, bad. But even when he showed him the dark mark still engraved on his arm and Scorpius had traced it with his finger, his mother standing behind them watching, he didn't blame his dad. And when he heard the stories at Hogwarts, 10 times worse than the ones his father had told him, he told himself that they weren't true, that they were exaggerated. He didn't blame him. Even when his teachers looked down their noses at him, he didn't blame his dad. 2. He does, however, blame him for his name. Because why the hell would you name your son Scorpius? He often wonders what was going through his mind when his parents were naming him Scorpius. It's just not normal. 3. His father changed his lifestyle dramatically, and Scorpius knew that. But he also knew that his father might possibly disown him if he wasn't in Slytherin. So, when the Hat had told him that he would excel in Ravenclaw, because of his brain, he nearly fell off the stool. Because he could not be in Ravenclaw. He had to be in Slytherin, if only so he had a place to sleep in the summer. So he begged the Hat to please put him in Slytherin, and the Hat obliged. Sometimes he wonders if it would have been better if he had let the Hat put him in Ravenclaw. Because then maybe he wouldn't have felt so alone, like such an outcast. He really didn't belong in Slytherin, and he knew that. But he wouldn't let anyone else know that. He still can't help but wonder, though, if it would have been better to just listen to the Hat. 4. Albus was the first to approach him. He was the first to sit down next to Scorpius and offer the hand of friendship, because both of them were pretty much alone. Scorpius because he wasn't really meant for Slytherin, and Albus because he was a Potter, and the other genuine Slytherins shunned him for that. So they band together, and were fast friends. And even though he's funny, and he had the guts to approach him, or that he never ever told a soul that Scorpius had ever been needy for friends, Scorpius is special. Lee loves Al for introducing him to Rose Weasley. 5. He had been prepared to run away from his home forever if his father had forbidden him from being friends with Al and Rose. Because they meant too much to him. And he wasn't going to let a silly childhood grudge his father still held prevent him from being with his best friends. So when he came off the train with them, laughing and talking, and introduced them to his dad, he gave him a look that told him they were his friends and there was nothing he could do about it. Truthfully, Scorpius was a little upset that he hadn't objected. Because the night before they left for Hogwarts he had stayed up all night preparing a speech of what he would say to his dad, and he was a little upset that he wouldn't be able to use it. It was a really good speech. Instead he recited it to Rose. She laughed, before telling him it was amazing and that it was a shame he hadn't gotten to use it. 6. He had always known Rose was pretty. From the moment Al had introduced them. He had been caught in her eyes, in her smile, in the fact that she didn't judge him, didn't scowl at his name. He had always known she was amazing, that she was smart and funny and beautiful. He hadn't really thought anything of it, though, because she was Al's cousin. And then, 4th year, the only real time she got genuinely mad at him, they fought a lot, but never that bad. When she screamed at him that he was an insensitive prick and that he deserved to be fed to a blast-ended Scroot and to wipe that bloody smirk off of his face, because there was no reason it had to be. Permanently painted on. To this day Scorpius doesn't even remember what the hell they were fighting about. He realized he was in love with her. Because looking at her, screaming at him in the middle of the hallway. Her eyes blazing dangerously and her wand poised, ready to hex him, he knew that he would let her scream at him and hex him all night, if it meant they would be friends again in the morning. He realized she could do anything to him that she wanted, as long as she didn't ever leave. 7. He first realized that he wanted to be with Rose, and no one else, for the rest of his life. And she got on a broom to help him practice for the upcoming Quidditch match against Gryffindor, because it was one of the most important games of Scorpius' Quidditch career. It meant so much because it was against Gryffindor, against James and Hugo and many more of her friends. But also because Rose was absolutely terrified of brooms, and had never ever liked Quidditch. It was then he realized how much she was willing to sacrifice for him. 8. When he and Rose decided to tell everyone about their relationship, he wasn't afraid of his dad, or Rose's dad who he really should have been afraid of, nor was he afraid of Hugo or even James. He was prepared to be hit by James, to be spoken to by Hugo, to be yelled at by his dad and Rosie's dad. He was willing to go through that, because it was for Rose, and he loved her. He was terrified of Albus finding out. Not only because he knew Albus would talk to him about it, would tell him not to hurt her, not that he would, but because he was scared Albus would think Scorpius was just hanging out with Albus to get to Rose. And that wasn't true. He loved Albus, and he loved Rose, in very different ways, obviously. Albus was his best friend. 9. He had never really considered himself friends with the rest of the Weasleys Potters. He just figured they put up with him because of Rose, and even if it made him sort of sad that he wasn't considered basically family, like Teddy Lupin was. He never really expected them to. He was Draco Malfoy's son, after all. Which was why he was so ecstatic when he received a small package of Bertie Bott's and a collection of chocolate frogs the Christmas after he came out with his relationship with Rose from her parents. While it was signed from her parents, but he had a feeling it was only her mother who had anything to do with it. He was so happy he wrote them a long letter describing just how happy he was and thanking them profusely, and apologizing for not getting them anything. 10. He loved Quidditch. He was Seeker on Slytherin. And followed the teams. His father took him to countless games, and one time he even convinced Rose to go to a game with him. But he was always slightly ashamed that his favorite team was always the Chudley Cannons. Because they really weren't all that good, and his father always ridiculed him for it. Eventually though, he began to be proud of his love for them. So one day, when he was sitting with Rose and her parents, needless to say it was quite an awkward lunch, and she commented that it was more likely for the Chudley Cannons to win the cup than for her dad to stop intruding on things that really weren't his business, he told her to expect him to mind his own business by next year, because they had a good team this year, and the odds were higher. It was love for the Cannons, who didn't win the cup that year, either, that convinced Ron he wasn't too bad, and often whenever the family was together they would go off and talk statistics. 1. Harry is his best friend. That much is obvious, and Ron never ever regretted becoming friends with Harry. Without Harry, half of his family would probably be dead. He knew Ginny would, and so would his dad. But it's not only because of that. Harry is his best friend because he makes him laugh and because he was always thinking of someone other than himself. Because he's loyal and honest and isn't like a pompous arrogant git like some other people would have had they been the one who had to save the world. But most of all, Harry is his best friend because he knows that if Ron had a real genuine problem with Harry dating Ginny, he wouldn't date her. And that meant a lot to Ron, that he came first. 2. If Harry is his best friend, Hermione is his love. He knows this now, even though it took him a while to figure it out. In second year, when she was petrified, he first realized he actually cared about her and what happened to her. In third year he realized he didn't really like living without her. Because during that fight of theirs he actually missed her. In fourth year he realized she was a girl and that he didn't want her dating anyone, being with anyone, even though he denied it to himself that it was jealousy. In fifth year he realized it wasn't normal to want your best girlfriend to not date anybody, and in sixth year he went out with Lavender Brown because he was absolutely terrified that he liked his best friend. In what would have been seventh year, he realized he was in love with her and wanted to be with her, always. 3. If asked to pinpoint the worst moment of his life, he couldn't do it. Because there were just so many. It could be second year, when he first found out Ginny was in the chamber, or later on, when Harry went on without him, when he didn't know if they were alive. It could be in fifth year, when his dad was attacked by the snake. It could be when they were in Malfoy Manor, and all he could hear was Hermione screaming, and all he could picture was Lestrange torturing her and then killing her, and he would never see her again. Or it could have been looking down at Fred's lifeless face, knowing he would never laugh again. All of those moments were terrible. But then again, it could also have been when Hermione went into labor and he wasn't there, when Ginny had to take her to the hospital. It could have been when the grim-faced Dr. C.A. meowed and told him that the baby was okay, but that Hermione wasn't, those few terrible hours, days, weeks. He had lost track of time, when he didn't know if she would live or die, when he couldn't even look at his daughter. It could have been the time he got a letter from Hogwarts saying Hugo had fallen from his broomstick and was currently unconscious in the hospital wing. It could have been time Rose told him she was in love with Scorpius Malfoy, and even if the last one was a joke, he had thought, for a while, that that was the worst thing that could have happened. Ron had had a lot of bad moments in his life. It was hard Too hard to pick which one was the worst. 4. Although he had a lot of good memories, too. Like before the war, just lounging around at Hogwarts with Harry and Hermione. Playing Quidditch in his backyard, studying for exams, and then the feeling of relief that came after they were done. When he finally kissed Hermione, when he was finally assured that she loved him back. When Harry forgave him for being such a twat and walking away, both times he did it. He was terrified when Hermione told him she was pregnant, and Rose's birth wasn't really a happy one, what with all the complications. But when he took her home and held her and realized that they were a family, and that they were all alive, he was ecstatic. And Hugo's birth had been magical, even W.I.T.H. Hermione screaming bloody murder beside him. And even though Hugo's first word had been Quidditch, or Kidditch, actually, Rosie's first word had been Daddy, and even though he knows Hermione was jealous as hell, he was beaming. So he had a lot of good times, too. His life wasn't just filled with pain. There was happiness to fill that void. 5. He didn't like working at the WWW. Not because of the actual work. Or the weird people he sometimes got in there. He didn't like working there because he knew he shouldn't be. He knew that it shouldn't be him wearing the uniform, it shouldn't be him standing behind the counter. It shouldn't be him discussing ideas for new products with George. Because it had been Fred and George's creation, not George and Ron's. It should be Fred doing all of the things Ron was doing. It should be Fred brainstorming ideas with his twin. Ron couldn't help but feel as if he was taking something away from Fred, as if he was stealing it under Fred's nose. The feeling of guilt persisted up until he left, and even a little bit after. 6. When Rose told him she was dating Scorpius Malfoy, his first instinct was to lock her in her bedroom for life. After remembering that one summer Harry had been locked in his bedroom, he decided an unbreakable chastity belt would suffice. Then he thought about his daughter shagging Draco Malfoy's son, and he gagged. Then, he thought about her shagging anyone. And he made a mental note to ask Hermione about an anti-aging spell. But then Hermione gripped his hand, whether to provide comfort or to stop him from running at Rose and never letting her go. He never really knew, and Rose continued to explain, and he gaped like a fish. But he nonetheless told Rosie it was okay to bring him around one day so they could meet. 7. In truth, he began to like Scorpius sooner than the lunch incident. He began to like him almost as soon as he met him, actually because he realized that he was so much unlike his father, that he wasn't cocky and rude. He was a polite boy who called them Mr. and Mrs. Weasley, and who complimented Hermione and respected Ron. Plus, he made Rose happy, and that's really all that mattered. Still, when the Chudley Cannon's comment was made, Ron took it as a way to ease everyone into the fact that he accepted Scorpius. No one ever knew he had liked the boy far longer than he let on, not even Scorpius. 8. The Christmas after Rose and Scorpius came out, Hermione told him she was sending him a Christmas present. Ron had told her that was ridiculous, and it was, really just because they were ting now didn't mean they would be dating in 2 weeks, in 3 weeks. Why send him a present if he wasn't even guaranteed to be around for long? But she had told him to accept the fact that they were dating. And to get the stick out of his ass. She came home after shopping with a bag of Bertie Bott's. She was worried that wouldn't be enough, but it wasn't like she knew what to get him. They didn't know the boy. She signed the card from both of them, despite the fact she told Ron he didn't deserve any credit, and sent them. The next day, Ron pulled out the package of chocolate frogs he had been saving and sent them off to Hogwarts, too. Because really, a bag of Bertie Bott's wasn't a very good Christmas present. When Scorpius sent the letter back thanking them for the beans and the chocolate frogs, Hermione gave him a look. Before getting up and kissing him. He didn't think he deserved any praise, mind you. He liked Scorpius, even if it didn't seem like it. 9. Hermione had wanted a big family. Because she had always felt lonely in her youth with no brothers or sisters. But one memory kept coming back to him when he was about 5 or 6, and he had drawn his mother a picture. It was of Molly, Arthur, and Ron, just Ron. No one else, and they all had their arms around one another and were surrounded by a heart. Ron had tried to give it to his mom, but she had been so caught up in everyone else she hadn't noticed him. Fred and George had ended up taking it from him and mocking him relentlessly for it, so he tore it up and cried alone in his room. He didn't want a big family. Because he wanted his kids to never have to fight for attention. He doesn't regret it, because he knows that even if he did have 5 more kids, Rose and Hugo would be his favorites, and he would never be able to forgive himself if he played favorites with his children. 10. He could never deal with tears. Whenever he himself had to cry, he would always seclude himself. The few times Ginny cried in her youth, Ron would go and get someone older and then run off and hide. He would always leave his mother's tears to someone else, and whenever Hermione cried he would immediately call Ginny. Needless to say, Ginny basically lived with them during both Hermione's pregnancies. Ron didn't deal well with hormones. Which was why, after the war, when Ron was at the burrow and he was sitting there, thinking about everything, and he heard his mom enter, crying, his immediate reaction was to run the other way. But when she saw him, she cried out, "Oh Ronnie," and then rushed forward and gave him the biggest hug, crying into his chest. And even though it was awkward as hell, he wrapped his arms around her and told her it was going to be okay, even though his heart was breaking. And even though he didn't know what to do, it felt nice to hug his mom, to know that even though she just lost her son, she still cared about Ron. When he was little, he always wondered where his dad went, who he was, what he was like. If he would have been a dad to Blaze, or if he would have been like stepdads number 3 and 5, who never paid any attention to him. If having his dad in his life would make his life different. When he got older, though, he no longer cared about his dad or what had happened to him, about whether he had been like the rest of his mother's husbands or whether he had been different, whether he had actually left. He didn't care anymore, because what was the point of caring, really? 2. He never ever liked any of his stepdads. All of them had been reduced to numbers. He couldn't recall any of their names, any of their faces. Stepdads 3 and 5 hadn't ever given a donkey ass about Blaze, and they didn't pretend to, either. If they were there in the summers they would ignore him completely. And if they were there in the winters he stayed at Hogwarts for the holidays. Stepdads 1 and 6 had actually been genuinely interested in his life, but he had shot them down almost immediately. And stepdads 2 and 4 hadn't given a shit but had pretended to. He didn't like any of them, and he found them all ridiculously dunce to continue falling for his mother. 3. But what he hated most of all was the accusations against his mother. He knew that a lot of his stepdads hadn't actually died of natural reasons, but to say his mother killed them all was an overstatement. Stepdad 4 had had a heart attack, while stepdad 2 had just been old, ridiculously old. Actually Blaze found it quite disgusting. And as for stepdad 5, well, his mother had claimed to actually be in love with him, which was something his mother never said, so he didn't know what had happened to him. 4. When he had been smaller, he had made friends with a muggle. Her name had been Courtney. And she wore flowers in her hair and smelled of strong perfume. When Blaze met her she had fallen off of the park equipment and onto the pavement, had ripped her dress and skinned her knee. It was only bleeding a little. But she still burst into tears, and when no parent rushed over, Blaze dug his heels in the sand and got off his swing, walking over to her and asking her what was wrong. She pointed out her knee and he helped her up and supported her the whole walk home. She had thanked him and kissed him on the cheek. When he went home he told his mother about the little girl. And she had given him a stern look and told him he wasn't to talk to that girl again, because she had dirty blood. Blaze hadn't really understand that, but he obliged, and when, the next day, that saw-me girl came up to him he pushed her down and walked away. He sometimes wonders if, had he never told his mother about Courtney, if he would have grown up believing something different about muggles, mudbloods and blood traitors. Then he looks at Hermione Granger and the Weasley family, and he's grateful his mother had taught him what she did. 5. He was terrified of going to Hogwarts. Because he had never really been away from his mother, from the luxuries he lived. He was afraid he wouldn't make friends, he would be ignored. But he was also afraid, and this he never shared with anyone, that something would happen to his mother. That something would happen and he wouldn't be there to protect her. That fear lasted until he met Draco Malfoy. 6. He's not really sure if Draco Malfoy turned him cold. Or if he had always had it in him. If it had been the many stepfathers who had ignored him, the detachment he had learned from the members of his family, that he put into use when talking to anyone he wasn't interested in. But somehow, he began to miss his mother less and less. 7. He loved girls. He loved girls more than anyone else he knew, even Draco. He didn't love girls individually, though. He loved them as a whole. And he could admit he took advantage of them. He reveled in it. He loved watching them fall for him and loved having them at his beck and call for a short while before leaving them. He would never admit that he craved their attention more than they craved his, that he craved having someone idolize him, even if only for a few days. 8. He didn't know it was his mother who had given him that need. That need to feel, not loved exactly, but powerful. Wanted. 9. The only reason he had gone to Slughorn's party was because Draco hadn't been invited. And it felt good, to be the one that was wanted. The one that wasn't stereotyped into Draco's gang of followers. He had thought it was a complete crock, especially seeing Potter and Granger there. But it felt good, too. Be able to go back and see how pissed Draco was, that for once he wasn't being doted on. 10. He really did find Ginny Weasley attractive. So attractive, he might have forgotten all about his hatred foe. Our mudbloods and blood traitors and gone out with her, and by that, he meant shag her once and then leave her, had he not been afraid, well, no, not afraid. Worried that his reputation would be tarnished. 1. People always say that one of the worst things the Dursleys ever did was give him a cupboard to sleep in. It came second only to putting bars on his windows and locking him in his room. But he never agreed with him. His cupboard was his safe haven. It was where he went when he just couldn't deal. It was in his cupboard where he could imagine that outside of it, it wasn't Aunt Petunia Str. Uggling with the bacon, eggs, toast, sausage and whatever else Dudley wanted to eat, but his own mother, making him a breakfast he was allowed to eat. Or that it wasn't Uncle Vernon coming in from work ND demanding not to be disturbed so he could watch television, but his dad, coming home from work and sweeping Harry up in his arms. In his cupboard he could pretend. In his opinion, the worst thing he Dursleys could have done was deny him the knowledge of what he was, who his parents were. The worst thing they did was leave him alone with only his imagination, let him suffer, because if he had have known life would have been so much easier, it would have been easier to live with the Dursleys, because then he would know he was getting out of there, at least. But at the same time, if he have known, it probably wouldn't have felt so right when he got his letter. And even though he was scared, a little disbelieving, he was happy. He was surprised and happy. And if he had have known, maybe he wouldn't have felt so happy. So maybe it all turned out right in the end. 2. His favorite times are the times when he forgets he's Harry Potter. When he's sitting with Ginny, or when he's with his children. Or at Weasley family gatherings. When he forgets that he vanquished the most evil dark wizard. When he's just Harry, when he can't remember all those who died, when he can't remember the final battle, the hurt. But then someone brings him back to Earth, whether it's a reporter or someone on the street, and he hates them, even though he knows that he shouldn't, for bringing him back to reality. 3. When they read about Scorpius Malfoy's birth in The Prophet, Ron turned to Harry and told him, with a wide grin on his face, that he would bet Harry a galleon that Scorpius would grow up to fall in love with Harry's daughter, if he ever had one. Harry bit his tongue, because at that time Hermione hadn't told Ron she was pregnant yet. 16 years later, he went up to Ron and told him he owed him a galleon. Ron, of course, didn't remember, but it still made Harry laugh, watching Ron's ears stay red for at least 4 hours after Rose told him she was dating Scorpius Malfoy. 4. He ever actually thought Ron and Hermione would get married. He had known for a while that they liked each other, back at Hogwarts, but he never thought anything would come of it. He was surprised when it did. But he didn't really care, except for when they started snogging in the middle of the war. It didn't actually change anything. Hermione wasn't exactly one for public displays of affection, so it wasn't like when they were together all they did was make out. But he didn't think they would last because all they did was fight. In fact, the fights were even worse, now that they were together. So when they were still together after all those years, when they were going to get married, Harry was surprised. Because he didn't think they would make it. But he was happy they did. 5. For a while after the war, he wouldn't talk to the Weasley family. Well, he couldn't just not talk to them, as he was living with them, but his days were spent holed up in his, Ron's room, refusing to speak to anyone except Hermione. He wouldn't even speak to Ron. Even when Ron asked him, multiple times, what was wrong, why he wouldn't speak to anyone, even when Ron told him what it was doing to his mother. It wasn't until Mrs. Weasley confronted him, sobbing, that Harry finally broke down, because he just couldn't sit there and be cold to Mrs. Weasley. He told her how he hadn't wanted to intrude on their lives. How he felt so guilty that Fred was dead. He spilled everything to her, about how bad he felt, about how sad he was, how much he missed everyone, how much he blamed himself. He told he hadn't talked to them because he wanted to make them hate him, because he felt he deserved it. He told her more that day than he had ever told anyone before in his life, even Dumbledore. Afterwards, she comforted him about everything. Except for him wanting them to hate him. She told him not to be stupid, that he could never do anything to make them hate him. 6. He loves his parents. More than anything. But he doesn't miss them. He can't, because how can you miss something you don't remember ever having? He's tried so hard to miss them, but he can't. And he hates himself for it. 7. Which was why, from the time Teddy could talk, Harry told him about his parents. Because he was determined that Teddy would grow up to miss his parents. He knew that it would hurt, but he knew that if Teddy didn't miss his parents, he would feel just the way Harry did. And Harry loved the boy too much to let that happen. 8. His greatest accomplishment is his family. It isn't defeating Voldemort, it isn't his job, it isn't anything else. It's his family, because that's all he had wanted when he had been young, was a family. And now he had one. 9. All of the deaths of his friends, of everyone he had ever known. They had affected him greatly. Of course they did, but only 2 deaths made him want to huddle up in a ball and never get up, and they were Dumbledore's and Fred's. Dumbledore's because he had been so close to him. Because Dumbledore had told him things no one else knew. Because Dumbledore hadn't treated him like a child, because he seemed to understand that he didn't want to be told a sugar-covered version of the truth. Because he knew what was out there. Because even though Dumbledore had protected him, it wasn't by shielding him from the truth. Dumbledore's death affected him because Dumbledore was the first one to love Harry, that he knew of anyway. Harry had given so much to Dumbledore, and Dumbledore so much of Harry, that a bit of Harry died when Dumbledore did. Fred's affected him so much because he knew Fred. True, he knew Colin and Tonks, Moody and Cedric, but for some reason it had been different with Fred. Because Fred was his family. Fred was like his brother almost. The brother who had given him the Marauders map, who had saved him from being locked behind bars, who had provided non-stop amusement during rainy days. The one who had given him life in 5th year. Because Fred was his family. And it always hurts more when your family dies. 10. He gets a lot of grief for naming his children after dead war heroes. From Hermione, from Molly, from reporters, even. But he doesn't care. Because he felt he owed them all something. They had died for him. The least he could do was make sure their name, their legacy, still lived on. 1. His first memory is of crying. In the beginning, that's all his grandmom did. Cry. He couldn't make out any words, just sobs. He had been a quiet baby, because his grandmom seemed to steal all of his tears. When he was older, he told Harry he didn't want to go back home, he wanted to live with him, because all his grandmom did was cry. Harry gave him a solemn look, bent down and took him into the next room. That's the first time Harry ever told him about his parents. Ginny told him he was too young. Harry disagreed. They actually got into a fight about it. Teddy pretended he didn't hear. So Harry told him, and he didn't hold it against his grandmother anymore when she cried. 2. The first time he stopped calling Harry Uncle Harry was the morning of his 11th birthday. He hadn't intentionally meant to do it. It hadn't been in his goal when he woke up in the morning. But it just seemed to fit with the whole growing up thing. That was the year he was going to get his letter from Hogwarts, the year he would be leaving for the first time. That was the year Harry finally filled him in on everything that had happened with his parents, filling in all the holes left by the countless, "When you're older," Harry had told him. That was the year Teddy Lupin grew up. So when he came downstairs and saw Harry, he ran up and gave him a hug. He had contemplated a handshake, but he thought that was too formal, and said, "Hi Harry." And then turned away to the big breakfast his grandmom had made him. He tells himself it was because it smelled so good, but the truth was he didn't want to see the look of hurt that crossed Harry's face when he said that. 3. That same year of his 11th birthday, he went through a phase when he wanted everyone to call him Ted, instead of Teddy. Everyone went along with it, because they figured it was just a phase. It wasn't until after Victoire came back from France with her family that he was able to tell her to call him Ted, and when he did, she burst out laughing and refused to do so. After that he never really pushed for it anymore. 4. Victoire was always his best friend. One of the worst things about leaving for Hogwarts was leaving her behind, watching her run after the train and craning his head so much to try and see her it left a kink in his neck for days. She was always his best friend. But there were a few months in his third year, her first, when they stopped talking. When he ignored her completely, because at that point, he had his friends at Hogwarts, and how cool was it, really, to be a 13-year-old metamorphagus hanging around with an 11-year-old. So he didn't talk to her for 4 months until one day one of his friends caught him staring at her and told him his hair was red. That was when he realized she was his best friend, and she could never be replaced. 5. But still, it wasn't until his 7th year that he finally realized he was in love with her. Sure, he had known he had a little crush on her, but he hadn't told a soul that, except for Ginny. But while everyone was partying back at the castle, he was sitting in the grounds with Victoire, just watching the lake, listening to her try to stop the tears. It was then had he realized it wasn't leaving Hogwarts that was making him so sad, it was leaving Victoire. 6. You can always tell what he's feeling or who he's thinking of by his hair. It changes of its own accord most times. And because of that, Teddy is as see-through as nearly headless Nick. When he's happy, so happy he might just explode, it's bubblegum pink. When he's thinking of his mom, it's electric blue. And when he's thinking about his dad, it's the same sandy color his dad's hair had been. When he's thinking about his godfather, it's jet black, and when he's thinking about the Weasleys, it's fire red. Victoire used to mock him ridiculously for it. 7. He was close to all of the Weasleys, but of all of them he was most distant with Rose. He didn't know why, he had just never had much contact with her. While the Potter children all adored him and Victoire's siblings, well, of course he was close to them. Rose and him had never been close. Even though her little brother idolized him, he had always felt awkward, being idolized. So it was a big surprise when, seeing her in the backyard of Molly's house one day, he had asked her, "What's up?" to be polite, you know, and she had promptly started telling him everything. Everything. But most importantly, Scorpius. She made him promise not to tell, and he swore he wouldn't. She wasn't asking for advice, and he didn't have any to give, she just needed someone to listen. And he was there. 8. The day before he left for Hogwarts, Harry presented him with the Marauders map. He told him the story of how he got, that his dad and Harry's dad, to mention Sirius and Wormtail, Harry didn't speak much about Wormtail, had made it together. He then told him that as the son of a marauder, he was expected to cause trouble, just not enough so that his grandmom was called. Harry also told him that he couldn't tell anyone he had given the map to Teddy, especially Ginny, Hermione or Andromeda. Teddy agreed. At the end of his 7th year, he gave it back to Harry. Not because he didn't want it anymore, he would have loved to have it. But because it was Harry's, rightfully, he felt. It was Harry's only link to his family, his real family, not that the Weasleys weren't his family. Teddy just understood that no one really could replace your parents. While Teddy had his grandmom, his Aunt Sissy, who had reconciled with Andromeda shortly after the war, Harry had only the map. 9. He was really close with his Aunt Sissy, and with Draco. In fact, he even invited them to his birthday one day, which turned out to be pretty awkward, and from that point on he had a private celebration with them. He didn't see why everyone was always so tense around them. But the last time he saw Draco before he left for Hogwarts, Draco told him everything. He said it was because Teddy might hear things about him at school, and he wanted to be the first one to tell Teddy. But even though Draco had done all of those terrible things, he didn't mind. Becca. Lots of people had done stupid things. It wasn't like everyone in his family was perfect. So he forgave Draco, and the first time he ever heard anything bad about the Malfoy name at school, he yelled loudly at the person who had said it and got detention. 10. But Harry is still his favorite. Not because he's his godfather, or because he's the greatest godfather in the world. But because Harry's been where he is. Harry's been orphaned, been left not knowing his parents. Harry's the only one who can really understand that sometimes, he misses them so much it hurts. And then sometimes, he's angry at them, so angry for leaving. Harry is the only one who listens when he yells, who can understand that he loves his grandmom so much, but she isn't his mom. Harry is the only one who understands, completely. And he is so grateful for it. Her parents had always told her that magic didn't exist. And so that's how she had lived. Magic didn't exist. Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, the Tooth Fairy, they weren't real. In her world, magic had been nothing but a silly fairy tale made up by someone who didn't want to accept reality. Because of this, it took her a while to truly accept magic was real. Because she had spent so long believing it wasn't, how was she just supposed to accept, right there, that if Percy wanted to, he could kill right there, and nobody would be able to figure out a cause for her death. 2. That was what scared her most about magic, the fact that against it, she was totally useless. It didn't matter if she was armed with a machine gun, a grenade, anything, she was still helpless. The fact that if Percy was sick of her, he could silence her forever. The way that if her children wanted to go someplace and she were stopping them, they could stun her and leave. That if her new family didn't like her, they could send her to Saudi Arabia. And even though she knew they never would, it didn't stop her from having nightmares the first few weeks after Percy told her he was a wizard of his family ganging up on her, making her unable to move, and then locking her in a closet for the rest of her life. 3. When Percy did finally tell her that he was a wizard, she didn't believe him. Because it wasn't possible, magic didn't exist. Even when he made the table float up into the air. Even when, at her request, he made her float up into the air. She still didn't believe it. It took him turning the armchair into a street Bernard that finally convinced her that he was telling her the truth. She yelled at him, then. She told him to get his weird devil tricks out of her house. And she slammed the door behind him, locking it and piling things up against it, because how easily could he get through a locked door? She was looking around for the armchair when the Saint Bernard came up to her and nudged her hand. Then she had to put everything back so she could get out the door, because she couldn't stay there anymore. Walking through London, she realized how much she had overreacted. She wanted Percy to come back, but she couldn't really call him, because he didn't have a cell phone. She had always thought that strange, now it made sense. And then she saw him, leaning against a wall of a building. He hadn't gone too far. His face was in his hands, so he didn't see her approach. She went up to him, touched his shoulder and realized that this was the only man she could love. Even if he did have magic powers. 4. One night, when she couldn't sleep, she crept out of bed, took Percy's wand from the night table, and then quietly went into the living room. She stared down at the stick, took a deep breath, and waved it, hoping for sparks, a light, a feeling of completeness, something. But nothing happened. It was as if she was waving around a stick, hoping fireworks would shoot out of it. She never told anyone, because she was ashamed of both what she had done and the fact that she was completely and totally, what was that word Percy had used? Muggle. But she had a feeling Percy knew. Anyway, Percy seemed to know everything. 5. She was absolutely terrified of meeting Percy's family. Because she was afraid they wouldn't accept her, that she would be shunned, that one outcast. The daughter-in-law nobody really liked but put up with. But when Percy introduced them, finally, Molly gave her a big hug, which Audrey wasn't used to, as her parents had never really been very affectionate. And even though he had so many siblings and such a big family, and even though his father was absolutely obsessed with her and kept asking her all these strange questions about things like electricity and subways, they were a great family, and Audrey had never felt so accepted, not even in her own family. 6. She was afraid that when she had children, they would be like her. That they wouldn't have any magic in them at all, that they would have to sit with the other children and hear stories about their school, and that they would hate her. She was terrified that they would be left out. So she was ecstatic and terrified when Molly, one day when she got very angry at her mother for not allowing her to have ice cream before dinner, made it fly out of the freezer and dump itself on Audrey's head. She was happy yet scared when Lucy leaned over too far over the balcony of Uncle George's house and fell, only to be stopped in midair as if she had been suspended by the ankle. She was terrified that her children had this power, and yet she was ecstatic that they would fit in, that they wouldn't have to feel like she did when the rest of Percy's family started talking about memories of Hogwarts and the war. 7. Despite this, she still made her children do all their chores, by hand. Even though Lucy openly complained and Molly turned stony and silent, she stuck to it. She didn't care if Percy could wave his wand and clean everything up. She had been brought up being taught that if you made the mess, you had to clean it up. It was also her way of keeping Molly and Lucy with her. On her level, one of her biggest fears was that they would grow up and leave her behind, they wouldn't accept her. So she tried to teach them that you couldn't always depend on magic. That you had to be able to know what to do if something happened so that you couldn't wave your wand and make every problem disappear. 8. She never told her parents that magic existed, that Percy was a wizard. That her children weren't going to a private school, that they were going to a school to learn magic. She knew they wouldn't believe it, and even if they did, they wouldn't accept it. But it still hurt. That every time, before they went over to her parents' house, Percy and the kids would sit down and concoct stories about what they were doing in school now. It hurt that to them, Percy was a lawyer. And that her children couldn't tell their grandparents about their owls or what they had done in Quidditch. Which was why she spent much more time with Molly and Arthur and all of Percy's family. Because even if she didn't mesh exactly with them, she still fit in a lot better than with her family. And there, her kids could be who they really were, Percy could be himself. And that's really all that mattered. 9. The only time she's ever been truly mad at Percy, so mad she actually considered leaving, she probably would have, had it not been for her children. Was when one day they were talking about the war and Audrey had said it was pointless for so many people to die. She couldn't understand, this Voldemort person, nor could she understand why Percy whispered it. And why he only said his name once, calling him you know who the other times. She couldn't grasp that he had split his soul into 7 pieces, that he had been immortal, for a time. And she didn't understand why so many people, including Percy's brother and Teddy Lupin's parents, had to die because of him. She had gotten into an argument with Percy about the war, and frustrated he had shouted out, "What do you know, you're a muggle. While we were out there fighting, you were sitting at home, completely oblivious to what was going on." She had gaped at him for a few moments, before getting up and storming out. Hence she came back that night at 3 in the morning, he was waiting up for her. He apologized, and said he never should have said it, had begged her to forgive him. She turned up her nose to him and told him she'd talk to him in the morning. But even before morning came around, she knew she forgave him. Because it was useless being mad at the truth. 10. Sometimes she wonders what life had been like had she married a muggle, had she never been introduced into the magical world. Had she kept on believing that there was no such thing as magic, as she had been taught. But then she looks around, at her children, her husband, her family, and she knows she wouldn't have it any other way. 1. He always knew he was different. That he wasn't the same. Even if he never really hung around with the other kids when he was little, he knew, just by watching them, that there was something else, something wrong with him. He just couldn't put his finger on it. He knew that he was bigger than the other kids, bigger than his dad, bigger than most. He just never knew why. When his dad finally sat him down and told him, at first he didn't believe it. Because, okay, he was big. But he wasn't that big. He wasn't giant big. But standing at the platform, towering over everyone there, he realized just what he was. And he was ashamed. 2. That shame didn't go away until he met Dumbledore. Somehow, Dumbledore made it all okay. Something about Dumbledore, the way he held himself, the way everyone looked up to him, even though he was just the Transfiguration teacher, well. It almost made it seem that Dumbledore was big. Bigger than Hagrid, even. Not physically, the man barely reached his waist. But Dumbledore filled the room, sometimes more than Hagrid did. But it wasn't just that. It was the way Dumbledore treated Hagrid like a person, not as a half-giant. The way he didn't back away in fear. The way he told Hagrid that there was nothing to be ashamed about, that Dumbledore himself was most likely somehow related to most creatures, and that Giant Squid and him were distantly related. Hagrid wouldn't have believed that even if Dumbledore hadn't winked afterwards. But it nonetheless made him feel better. Dumbledore was the one who convinced him to let go of the shame and embrace what he was. It was Dumbledore who made him proud. 3. It was Dumbledore he went to when he was expelled. Dumbledore was the only one he could think of when he heard those words, those awful words. Dumbledore listened to him blubber like a baby, listened to him. Hagrid denied it up till the end. And Dumbledore always sided with him. However, it was possible Dumbledore couldn't understand him while he was sobbing so hard. He had never hated anybody more than whoever or whatever it was that was doing this, not only because of that girl, but because they had taken away the only home he had, now that his dad was gone. It was Dumbledore who convinced Dippet to train him. Dumbledore who gave him his home, who gave him the greatest job he could think of. Lily came to have tea with him at least once a week. James and his friends always dropped by to talk. And Sirius Black was the only one he knew who actually liked his rock cakes, who always demanded more. So when he first heard it, he refused to believe. Because it could not be true. Lily and James could not be dead. Especially not at the hands of Sirius Black. Potter and Black were the best of friends. Sirius would never, could never, it just couldn't be true. And Harry, what would happen to Harry? Hagrid had decided long before Dumbledore asked him that he was going to rescue Harry, and had Dumbledore actually forbidden it, it would have been the first and only time he ever disobeyed Dumbledore. 5. He's been angry plenty of times. He gets angry a lot, especially when he's been drinking a lot. But the angriest he's ever been is when he found out how those muggles were treating Harry. When he found out that he didn't know who he was, what he had done, anything about his parents. A car crash. Car crash his ass. He would have hexed them all, right then and there, if it hadn't been for Harry. If it hadn't been for Harry, that fat cousin of his would have had more than just a pig snout, that woman would know what a long neck really was, and that Dursley, well, he had never met a man as insufferable in his life. Saying that stuff about Dumbledore. Dumbledore, the bravest man he knew. He didn't know exactly what he would have done to Dursley, but he knew that if hadn't been for Harry he probably would have paid a fairly long visit to Azkaban. Hagrid had absolutely no control over his temper. 6. He was determined to keep Harry safe. Because he hadn't been able to keep Lily and James safe. Hadn't kept Sirius safe, so he was determined to keep him safe. Not only because he felt he owed it to them, because he loved Harry and Ron and Hermione. They kept him going through all the hard times. So it was that much more painful to see him lying on the forest floor. To carry his lifeless body in his arms. To realize that there was no more hope. Because Harry Potter was dead. And there was nothing he could do about it. Hagrid had failed, once again, only this time the whole world was going to pay the consequence. 7. He knew deep down that his mother was dead. Because there just was no way she could possibly be alive. Long ago he had given up any hope for parental figures. So leaving to recruit giants, even though he still hoped, wished that maybe, she was alive. He hadn't really expected to come out of there with any family. Which was why he had to bring Grop home. Because Grop was his brother. His real-life brother, whether half or not. And even if he couldn't speak properly, even if he had to be contained, lest he destroy the forest, even if he couldn't tell him anything about his mother, he was his brother. He was his family. 8. He had thought, at the time, that his father's death was the hardest he would ever have to deal with. Because it was his father, the man who raised him, who loved him, the man who never judged him. And him dying, that hurt more than anything. He wasn't sure, at that time, that he would be able to live through it. Because it was hard, so hard, to live without him, hard to breathe, like a weight on his chest. Then he saw Dumbledore's lifeless body, lying limp at the bottom of the tower. And he knew, he just knew, that this wasn't something Dumbledore could just snap out of. Not even Albus Dumbledore could defeat death. And suddenly Hagrid's world came crashing down. Because Dumbledore, the man who had given him everything, the greatest man he ever knew, the bravest, most powerful, the smartest man he knew, was dead. Gone. Forever. And Hagrid didn't know how to cope without him. 9. Winning the war was bittersweet. Because yes, you know who was gone, forever. They were, essentially, safe now. Minus the stray Death Eaters. And he was relieved. But walking through Hogwarts, his home, looking at all of the bodies, at the faces of people he knew, people he loved, faces that would never laugh or talk or cry again. He had a mix of emotion in which all he wanted to do was cry, hit, yell, curse and run away, all at the same time, and he couldn't deal with those emotions. Looking around at Remus and Tonks. At that Creevy boy, at Fred Weasley, it was too much. He didn't know what to do with himself. In times like those, he always turned to Dumbledore, but Dumbledore was gone. Gone. And who was he supposed to turn to now? 10. He's gotten better at teaching, but still, for every 5 students who enjoy his class, there's one who doesn't, one who sneers and makes jokes and doesn't return. But he's okay with that. Because then there's Albus Potter, who always gets so thoughtful around any kind of creature, magical or not, and Rose Weasley, who asks question after question until she understands everything before she allows herself to enjoy them. There's Scorpius Malfoy, who, instead of smirking, smiles when Hagrid stutters or stumbles and helps him, who stays after class with Albus to help him out. There's James and Teddy and Victoire and Lily, and countless others who respect him but who, more importantly, complete him, who pick up the pieces he had lost along the way and put him back together. 1. Bella was her favorite sister for as long as she could remember. Because Bellatrix was strong, would stand up for what she believed in. She wasn't afraid of anyone. Not her parents. Not the teachers. Bellatrix only listened to what she wanted to. At the time Narcissa didn't take that for arrogance, she took it as strength. And she envied that Bella was so strong. Andromeda was the opposite. Never did she stand up for herself, never did she stand up for Narcissa. She would sit there and take whatever people dished at her, without a complaint, waiting until she was alone to cry into her pillow. Narcissa didn't understand why she didn't stand up for herself like Bella did. To her, Andromeda wasn't strong. Andromeda stayed in her room and wrote letters to someone secret. While Bellatrix played with Sissy, played mudbloods and muggles. Then Andromeda did something stronger than anyone Narcissa ever knew. Andromeda fell in love with a mudblood. Andromeda ran away with that mudblood. And Narcissa realized that Andromeda was the strongest in the family. And Narcissa felt terrible, absolutely terrible, for favoring Bella. 2. Her parents never really showed her any love. When she was going to Hogwarts for the first time, she was terrified, and she had no one to turn to. Not her sisters, not her parents. She knew they wouldn't tell her anything comforting. They would just tell her it was stupid to worry. So at an early age, Narcissa learned to keep her feelings to herself, to keep a calm facade, in public at least. In the safety of her room, that was a different story. That was when she let it all come out. 3. Sissy was the only one invited to Andromeda's wedding. The invitation was sent in private, and Narcissa planned on going. But then Bella found the invitation in her room, threw it in the fire, and gave Narcissa a scathing look that scared her. Ever the actress, Narcissa sneered back, and told Bella she had just saved her from touching the piece of filth. Bella gave her a long look at that, and then left. But Narcissa knew Bella hadn't believed her. 4. Andromeda, despite the fact that Sissy hadn't come to her wedding, sent her regular letters, telling her how things were going in her life. She didn't expect letters back. That much was obvious, since the letters kept coming despite Sissy's silence. She loved hearing from her sister, even if she couldn't write back. Because it kept her in touch. It let her know that Andromeda still loved her. But then she met Lucius Malfoy. He swept her up off her feet, and she loved him more than anyone. He was smart, handsome, pure-blooded, rich, everything her parents could have asked for. And then, after her relationship with him persisted, the letters stopped coming. 5. The greatest thing Lucius ever gave her was Draco. Her son. She loved him with all the love she could muster, with more love than she was ever taught. She loved her son more than anything. He was her world. But there was one thing that scared her more than anything, and the day Draco was born she looked at Lucius with the sternest look she could muster and told him that her son would never be a Death Eater. She didn't know what hurt more. 16 years later, the fact that her baby was in trouble, or the fact that Lucius had broken his promise. 6. Nobody really put 2 and 2 together and realized she had saved Harry Potter's life. She's not sure if she's happy about this or not. All she knows is that she saw him lying there and thought that it was the end, Voldemort had won. And for some reason, she didn't want this to happen. It took her a while to realize that had been her unconscious wish for a while. 7. She's so glad that Draco found someone to be with who loves him unconditionally, despite all the things that he had done. And she really loved Astoria. It makes her so happy that Draco can be happy. Still, she couldn't help but wish that they had blessed her with more grandchildren than just Scorpius. Not that Scorpius isn't enough, she loves him more than words can say. But she just always wanted her children and her grandchildren to have siblings, so they could have someone to turn to. 8. Someone to turn to. That was what convinced her to make up with Andromeda. To go over to her house and plead to be forgiven, to be accepted into her life again. That's when Andromeda told her everything. And in those moments, Narcissa hated Bellatrix with more passion than she had ever experienced in her life. She hated Bella for putting Draco in danger, for putting Voldemort before her family, but most of all, for killing Nymphadora, the niece she never knew, for tearing apart Andromeda. And at that moment she was glad Bella was dead. She knew she should never feel that way about her sister, but she couldn't help it. 9. Scorpius came to her first about Rose Weasley. He didn't ask her permission, which she was grateful for. She didn't know if she had the strength to turn against everything she ever knew, to turn against Lucius. He asked for advice. He told her that he was in love with her, and that he was going for it, no matter what she or his dad or his granddad thought. In Scorpius Shish, he saw the same strength she had seen in Andromeda, so many years ago, but she knew that there was no way, ever, that Scorpius was being let go of, no way he was leaving the family like Andromeda. So even though Lucius sulked for weeks, even though Draco, despite having let go of most of his childhood prejudices, nearly blew up in his face, Narcissa was the first one who met her. She really liked Rose Weasley. Not just because she's a nice girl, or because she's smart. Because she makes Scorpius happy. 10. If there's one thing Narcissa learned throughout her life, it was that family was the most important thing in the world. Because without family, you're nobody. You have no origins. And, even though it took her a while to finally be able to admit this to herself, she would rather be a mug. Born with a huge and loving family than be a pureblood, alone in the world, 6 feet under after giving her life to someone who cared for nobody but himself. Back at Muggle school, she had never felt like she belonged. She hadn't had friends, instead had just stayed secluded with her books, getting higher grades than everyone in the class and being praised by the teachers. It wasn't until she got her letter, until someone came to explain everything to her, that she realized why she didn't feel like she belonged because she didn't belong. It cleared everything up. Why the night before a big test she needed to study for, she never got tired. Why, after Janet Nicholson mocked her for her hair, she came to school with half of it missing. It explained so much. And Hermione was so excited to go to this new school. Because this was where it would all change. It hurt more than it ever did in Muggle school when she was proved wrong. 2. Of all the people she ever knew, Ron made her cry the most. There was the first time with the troll, in 3rd year when they got in that fight. She almost never stopped crying, in 4th year when she realized that all these years she had felt something for him and he hadn't even realized she was a girl. Then there was the whole thing in the forest, when he left. She's never cried harder, never cried more, and it was hard because she tried so hard to be strong, to get over it. Because she knew Harry didn't need to hear her blubbering. And yet she just couldn't stop. But he came back, eventually. That was the thing with Ron, he always came back. Hermione could always count on him for that. 3. Sometimes, she got so sick of boys. So sick she just wanted to leave, to stop being friends with them and try to grow up normally, well, as normal as a witch can get without worrying so much about Voldemort or prophecies or whether she was going to live or die. Sometimes she just couldn't take it. But she knows that she wouldn't be able to just forget Ron and Harry. She could never become friends, close friends, with Parvati or Lavender, never. Even Ginny, who is her best girlfriend, wouldn't have been enough. From day one, Hermione belonged with Ron and Harry. 4. She never really liked Victor. Not that way, at least. As a friend, yes, because he was a really nice boy, despite all the fame. However, it wasn't so much that she was attracted to him, more that he flattered her. When Ron was completely oblivious, Victor was there, making her laugh, making her smile, making her feel like she was beautiful. But the first time he kissed her, she pulled away and shook her head, telling him that she was sorry, but she couldn't. Because how could she kiss Victor when she was wishing it was Ron? 5. She hated being an only child. Because she had no one to turn to in the early years. Hadn't had a sister or a brother to form a bond with. And even though Ron constantly complains about it, she doesn't really understand how a big family could be bad. It would just like having many close friends. Hermione loves spending time with the Weasley family, because they all just mold together, even with one of the pieces missing. But Ron wouldn't have it. He told her that if she knew what it was really like to have such a big family, she wouldn't wish it upon her children. And Hermione trusted him, because, well, why wouldn't she? It seemed to bug Ron so much. So she had 2 children, and she's happy that she did. Because they can't get much better than Rose and Hugo. 6. With her grades, in the beginning, she studied hard and did well because she wanted to prove something. She wanted to prove that she belonged at Hogwarts, because if she didn't belong at Hogwarts, where did she belong? So she worked hard and did well because she wanted to prove something. And many people complimented her and congratulated her on her hard work. But then, it seemed as if it was just expected of her. When she did perfect on a test, it wasn't, "Excellent job, Ms. Granger," it was more, "Well, of course she got perfect. I expected nothing left." That was when her school work became a chore for her. 7. Despite what everyone always said, she felt inferior than people because of her blood. Because both of her parents were Muggles. She felt like she didn't belong, felt like she had so much more to prove, that she had to work harder. And even if she didn't show it, every time anyone, Malfoy included, muttered that word, mudblood at her, it stung, and the pain didn't lessen despite the amount of times she had heard it. 8. She knows it is absolutely terrible. But she favors Harry's and Ginny's kids over the others. She really can't help it. It's just that James is so adorable, and he reminds her a bit of Harry, when he was younger, before he had all those troubles. Before Voldemort robbed him of his innocence. And Albus, sweet, thoughtful, Albus, how could you not love Albus? And Lily, so much like Ginny, outspoken, strong, a powerful witch with much too quick a temper. Plus she had been there with them since birth, had helped raise them, almost, and Lily and Hugo and Albus and Rosie were so close, best friends. It doesn't stop her from loving her other nieces and nephews. Molly and Lucy, Fred and Roxanne, she loves them all, of course. 9. When Rose told her about Scorpius, at first she refused to believe it. Because that couldn't be right, her baby, her Rosie. She couldn't have fallen for a Malfoy. And even though he was such a nice boy, so sweet and clearly crazy for her daughter, she still couldn't help but remember his father's face, sneering at her. Hissing angry, insulting words under his breath. But she shook it off, especially when they met up with Draco one awkward time, and he told them that he could understood if they disapproved of the relationship, but he insisted they let it live on, because he had never seen his son happier. That was when she knew that he had changed, and he had raised his son to reflect that change. That was when she could let go of all those names he called her, all those times he made her second guess herself and her talent, her ability. 10. She knew she was crazy about Ron. But she never really knew how deeply they cared for each other until he came with her to find her parents, when he held her hand as she fought back tears when they stared at her with blank, unseeing eyes. That was one of the hardest things, knowing that they didn't recognize her. But he squeezed her hand and gave her support while she cast the spell, and from that moment on she knew she could never love anyone more than she loved Ron. When he was little, he looked up to Bella. He favored Bella above anyone, he admired her, he followed her around like a little puppy dog. And she let him, which made him love her even more. Because Bella taught him how to ride a broomstick. Bella would sit with him in the quiet and eat Bertie Bott's, eating every flavor Sirius wouldn't touch. Bella told him there was nothing to be afraid of in the dark. That was why it hurt so much, when, after the hat put him in Gryffindor, Bella wouldn't talk to him anymore. She wouldn't look at him anymore. She wouldn't go near him anymore. When she avoided him like the plague. That was why it hurt so much, hearing about all the things she had done, about her devotion to Voldemort, about her in Azkaban. That was why it hurt so much. Looking into her wild eyes, and knowing that his favorite cousin was about to kill him. 2. Before he met James, he really thought that blacks were better. James was the one that made him realize that they weren't. Not because James made him feel ashamed of himself, but because James made him feel good about himself. Because when, just before the train reached the station, Sirius turned to James and said, "What if I really am in Slytherin?" James thought for a while, before answering, "We can still be friends, as long as you don't turn completely evil." That was when Sirius realized that James would still like him no matter what house he was in. That was when he realized that James would like him no matter what, even if his family didn't. 3. He's cried twice in his life. Once was the night when Lily and James died, when he stood in the rubble of their house and realized what had happened, what he had done. When he realized his mistake, when he knew that Peter was a spy. Peter had betrayed his two best friends. When he realized that if he had done what they wanted, they would be alive. That his overprotectiveness killed his best friends. The second time was when he heard his brother was dead. When he found out Regulus was dead, and that he had died because he had realized the truth, too late. It wouldn't have hurt so much if his brother had died because say Voldemort was just fed up with him. It wouldn't have been as painful if his brother had died oblivious, died believing that Voldemort was right, was powerful. It would have been easier to hate him then. But knowing that his brother had known the truth, had died trying to destroy the cause he had devoted himself to, it killed him. Because Regulus was his brother. No matter what he had on his arm, he was still his brother. 4. In Azkaban, he nearly went mad. Because he wasn't the type of person that could live in solitude, he needed to be out, experiencing the world. He needed to feel the sun on his skin again. And then he saw Peter. And he felt emotions he hadn't felt in years. He felt betrayal, determination, but most of all, anger. Raw anger he hadn't felt since standing in the ruins of Lily and James's house. Anger that made him strong enough to get out. Because Peter would pay for what he had did. 5. He hated Snape. He hated Snape more than words could possibly describe, because Snape was a constant reminder of what he could have been, of what he would have been like, had he not been in Gryffindor, had he not met his friends. But more than that, Snape was dirty, and greasy, and had his nose in the air. Snape believed in Voldemort. Snape had hurt Lily so badly. Sirius hated Snape. It wasn't just a childhood grudge, it was unadulterated hate. Which was why Sirius didn't feel bad about leading Snape into the tunnel that one time. Oh, he felt terrible about it, terrible enough that he hated himself, couldn't look in the mirror for ages, but that wasn't because of Snape. That was because of Remus. Of his friend, of using his condition, his terrible problem as a way to fuel Sirius hate, and he could never forgive himself for that. He didn't care what happened to Snape, maybe he was petty that way. But he didn't care. But Remus hadn't done anything. He hadn't deserved what Sirius had done. 6. He loved Harry. More than anything, he loved Harry. But what Molly had said that one time, when she had told him that he wasn't James, that had stung. Because Harry wasn't James. No matter how much he looked like him, no matter how much he was like him, he wasn't James, and he never would be. Maybe he could have been, if he hadn't the weight of the whole bloody world on his shoulders. Maybe he could have been like James, except Sirius knew that that wasn't possible. Harry couldn't be James. Because mixed with James's spontaneous attitude was Lily's ability to keep a clear head, to think things through. Mixed with James's arrogant nature, he had been a little arrogant, was Lily's selflessness. Harry had both of Lily and James in him, two conflicting natures, and there was no way he could ever be James. It was when Sirius realized this did he realize just how much he missed James. 7. When he first saw Ginny Weasley, he wanted Harry to fall for her. Not because of her personality or anything, because it would have been perfect, having Harry, the spitting image of James, fall for a redhead. Just like with James and Lily. But then he really got to know Ginny, and he wanted Harry to fall for her because of what she was like, because she was smart and pretty and strong and didn't seem to take his crap. The whole redheaded thing was just an added bonus. 8. Being back at Grimmauld Place was like being back in Azkaban, only somehow, it was worse. Becca. Use even if it didn't have Dementors ready to suck out his soul, at least Azkaban was new. But being back there, it was like he was 16 years old again, and this time, James wasn't there to take him away. This time, he had to face his demons by himself, and Sirius wasn't sure if he was able to do that. 9. He's upset that he never got to live happily ever after. That he never got married and had children, never saw them off to Hogwarts. Never hugged his wife at night, never felt that feeling of completeness. But staring at Harry, he almost makes it okay. And even though he never did have kids of his own, Harry was enough. 10. He wanted to do 3 things while he died. He wanted to die in battle, he wanted to die protecting someone he loved, and he wanted to die laughing. He got his wish, he died protecting Harry. He died laughing, and he died fighting. But the fact that he died fighting Bellatrix Bella, his favorite cousin, that hurt him a little bit. And even though it seemed almost Fitting that he be killed by a family member, that they rid the black name of his betrayal forever. He wishes it hadn't been Bella. Anyone else, but not Bella. When he lost his ear, it terrified him. Because suddenly, he and Fred were different. They could be told apart. And it terrified him, almost as if he and Fred weren't twins anymore, because he and Fred had done everything together. If George had a gaping hole in the side of his head, shouldn't Fred have one, too? It's a no-brainer that the worst thing that ever happened to him was Fred's death. Of course it was. How could it not be? Fred was half of him. Fred was his twin, Fred was his best friend. Fred was there when no one else was. It was always Fred and George. They couldn't be separated, couldn't be isolated. When Fred died, it left a hole in him. A hole he didn't know how to fill. It would have been easier, maybe, if he had seen it coming. Or at least if he expected it. But looking around the room before the battle, he thought to himself. Someone is going to die. Because we can't all make it out of this alive. We just can't. Still, though, as his eyes raked over his parents, Ginny, Ron, his brothers, he never once thought of Fred. Because if Fred died, George died. And George wasn't ready to die. As it was, George didn't die. As much as he wanted to. He didn't slump over in the middle of battle, didn't die of some unknown cause when his brother went down. He didn't feel anything at all. He didn't feel as if half of his soul had just been ripped out. He didn't feel as if his best friend had just left the earth. He didn't feel anything. In fact, he was rather enjoying himself, taking down Death Eaters and watching them fall. And he felt that he should have felt something that would alert him to the horrible truth. He had felt it when they were 7 and Fred had broken his arm falling off a broom. Shouldn't he feel it now? It hurt a lot when his mother couldn't look at him straight. In the eye for weeks after the battle. Hurt a lot when people would stare at him and start to cry. Hurt a lot no one could say Fred's name for so long after his death. Because he felt like it should. DB talked about it should be out in the open, because that had to be better than to have it hanging ominously in the air between them all. It hurt, in later years, when people no longer mixed them up. It hurt that, when he met new people, he couldn't introduce them to Fred and George, just George. Fred hurt him a lot, and he's never healed completely. He never ever thought that he and Angelina would get together. Because he had never thought of her, not that way. Sure, there was a little crush in 5th year, but that was short-lasting, and it was Fred who ended up taking her to the ball the next year. But really, he should have known that one of them would end up falling for her. She was the only one who could actually tell them apart, after all, and they had always been friends. So one of them had to fall for her. And with Fred gone, who was there left but George? He loves Angelina so much. Because she's his rock, and in the beginning, he could barely bring himself to look in a mirror. She was there through it all. It was ages before he could even bring himself to think of having a relationship, to think of giving away the pieces of his heart that had been broken when Fred had died. Ages still before he realized that maybe he loved Angelina too much for her to be just a friend. Ages still before he acted on it. But when he kissed her, gently, she kissed him gently back, never rushing him. Never pressuring him, and he loves that she'll be with him no matter how long it takes him. But still, through his relationship with her he always felt Fred's absence. So much so that one day he went to his grave and stood there for a while without speaking. Then, finally, he said, "I'm happy. I'm happy. Why can't you let me be happy? Why do you always have to follow me? Reminding me that you can never be as happy as I can." He can't really explain, but while there he got an epiphany. And he just knew that it was Fred. But suddenly, he realized that it wasn't Fred that was making him miserable. It was him, always bringing up Fred at the most inopportune times, making himself feel guilty. It wasn't Fred who was making him unhappy, it was George. That was when he realized that feeling guilty about Fred had been keeping him back from really being truly happy. A few weeks afterwards, he proposed to Angelina. It wasn't really like he and Angelina had sat down and discussed that they would name their son Fred. But one day, around the 7th month, Angelina leaned against the doorframe and said, "So, his name's Fred then?" And George nodded wordlessly. He knows his son has it tough. He knows his mom, for one, had trouble saying his name for a while, and even now she sometimes gets teary-eyed. But he doesn't regret naming his son Fred. Never. 8. For a while after Fred's death, he seriously contemplated shutting down the WWW. Because how was he supposed to work there? How was he supposed to work in the place Fred had been planning since they were 13 years old? How could he stand behind the counter and watch people play with the products Fred had thought up of? But then Percy came. Percy came and asked him if he could work with him, and then Ron asked the same question. And George realized that the last thing Fred would have wanted was for him to close the shop. And working there, alongside his brothers, he realized that it was still Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. With him and Ron and Percy. 9. Sometimes, he just needs to be alone. Because at times, things get too much for him, too tough, and he needs to just sit by himself and ponder the way his life is going. Most people don't understand this, and it bugs him to no end the way his mother will constantly harp at him with questions, the way his dad seems completely oblivious to the fact that he needs a moment to himself, the way Ron will storm in and start complaining about his life, not seeming to care about George's. But then there's Ginny, who will avoid him like the plague when he gets like that. And Harry, who seems to recognize his need for solitude better than anyone. Bill doesn't exactly understand, but he respects it. And Angelina will sit with him, not talking, not touching him, just there. So that if he needs it, he can reach across and grab her hand, or pull her tightly against his chest, and he loves that most about her. 10. Even now, when he's with his whole family, and they're laughing and cracking jokes and having fun, he can't help but think about his brother, about what he would have been doing, where he would have been in life. If he would have had any children, a wife. No one talks about him, still. George still doesn't like that. Shouldn't they be talking about him, telling stories? Things like, remember when Fred did this, or remember when Fred said. But instead there's just an awkward silence when someone slips and gets too close to saying his name, and the story goes unfinished as they all sit in awkward silence. And George can't help but think that even after all these years, his family is just a mixture of broken pieces, broken apart completely by a 20-year-old boy who laughed too much. When he was little, he was deathly afraid of the dark. Because the dark was so scary. He heard things in the dark he didn't hear in the light, heard creaks and moans that were all just the old house, but to little Draco they were monsters. Waiting for the precise moment before coming out and eating him. The dark was filled with scary unknowns, and Draco never really felt safe until first light. When he was older, he was deathly afraid of the dark. Because at least in the light, he could pretend. He could pretend that he wasn't afraid of the war, he could pretend that he knew what he was doing, he could pretend that he was the Dark Lord's favorite. But in the dark he couldn't pretend. In the dark he was faced with his fear that he would die, that he would be killed, that he would fail and be murdered. In the dark there were monsters. And not monsters from his childhood, no ghouls, goblins or trolls. The monsters were his own personal demons, and Draco didn't know how to escape those. 2. It had actually hurt a little. When Harry Potter refused to be friends with him. Not just because Draco had been used to getting everything he wanted, to having people lined up because of who he was and for his last name, but Harry Potter was the first person to make him feel insignificant. He continued to make him feel insignificant throughout his time at Hogwarts. Draco wasn't used to being anything less than the center of attention. So where did Potter get off, always acting the hero? But suddenly, there he was, rescuing the stone, saving the mudbloods who were better off petrified, anyway, becoming a bloody champion and babbling stories about the Dark Lord that Draco knew were true. And where did Potter get off, saving his life like that? Because nothing was worse than feeling like you were in debt to the one person you hated with more passion than most people could muster in all their lives. Who did Potter think he was? But what Draco hated most was that whoever Potter thought he was, Draco wanted to be it. If not it, the equivalent to it. 3. When Voldemort told him his task, that he was to kill Dumbledore, he didn't really think much about it. Yes, it was a big deal, and Draco would have to become a murderer. And maybe he wasn't happy about it, but he could do it. He had never really liked Dumbledore anyway. He was odd, crazy, a Gryffindor and mudblood lover, and anyone who thought that GHLY of Harry Potter was clearly off his crocker. But then, suddenly, Draco was there. He had Dumbledore vulnerable, and there was nothing the old man could do but plead. but staring into Dumbledore's bright blue eyes. All he could see was the man who had never judged him. The man who he learned under for 6 years. The man who had done nothing but fight for what he believed in, and really, wasn't that what they all were doing? Fighting for what they believed in. Since when did you deserve to be punished for believing? Draco didn't like Dumbledore, but he couldn't kill him. He just couldn't. 4. Then Dumbledore promised him the only thing Draco really wanted in the middle of the chaos: safety. And Draco sighed, because finally he would be safe, him and his mother. His father wouldn't go along, but that was okay. Dumbledore would protect them. Draco didn't care about the war anymore. He didn't care about darkness or light. He just wanted to know he would live to see tomorrow, and Dumbledore would help that. Dumbledore could give him that. Then he heard the Death Eaters from downstairs, and there was no more hope after that. 5. For a while, he hated his father. For a lot of things: for putting his family in danger. For putting his mother in danger, for sacrificing everything to serve a man too drunk on power to think straight, but most of all for the mark still imprinted on his arm. The mark he couldn't get off no matter how hard he tried, the mark that made it almost impossible to start anew. Draco hated the mark on his arm more than anything else, because the mark made it impossible to hide from what he had been. But he found it impossible to hate his father. He couldn't turn his back on the man who raised him. But still, when Draco would lie in bed at night and let his thoughts wander to the mark on his arm, he knew he could never actually completely forgive his father for giving his only son to the Dark Lord. 6. Even though the war should have taught him differently. He believed that pure blood was better blood. He had grown up believing that that was all he had been taught. So even though mudbloods and muggles were much more accepted after the war, Draco still stuck with his pure blood group of friends. He kept on believing this until he met Astoria. Not because she taught him differently, she had been brought up believing the same things he had. No, he stopped believing, at least. Not as much as he had used to, because he knew that even if Astoria had been a mudblood, hell, even if Astoria had been a muggle, he would have still loved her. Because there was no way he could live without Astoria no matter what blood she had. 7. He was absolutely terrified when he found out he was going to become a father. Because he was afraid that he didn't know how to be a good father. The only father he really knew was his, and looking at the mark on his arm he knew he didn't want to raise his own child like his dad had raised him. He wanted to raise his kid knowing who they were. And yet at the same time, he didn't want them to make the same mistakes Draco had made. He wanted his child to know that they were pure-blooded, and be proud of that, but he did. He want them to be plagued with thoughts that they was better than everyone else, because Draco knew that thinking like that would only get you into trouble. But it was more than that. It was the fear that his child would find out what Draco had done, and they would hate him for it. But holding Scorpius in his arms, all those fears vanished. This was his son, and he was going to raise him right. 8. Despite the fact Draco had left most of his childhood grudges behind him, he couldn't help but be a little upset when Scorpius told him about Rose Weasley. Because how was it, that of all the girls out there Scorpius could have fallen for, it had to be Rose Weasley? Was it fate getting back at him, karma for all those times he mocked Weasley and Granger? But Rose was a really nice girl, and she made Scorpius happy. And besides, it could have been worse. It could have been Lily Potter. 9. He is constantly faced with memories from the battle, continually haunted by what had happened, by what he had done. He would hear the screams of people he had tortured, the fire going out of someone's eyes as he stared at them, would hear the sobbing of broken families. He would see Voldemort's cold eyes as he told him to kill Albus Dumbledore, would see his mother's furious face and his father's cold eyes, would feel the burn on his skin from the dark mark. He would see Crabbe's wild eyes just before he died, would see Harry Potter. Would see the Dark Lord fall. For years he faced the nightmares alone, curling up in his bed and trying to decide what was worse, the unconscious demons or the conscious ones. But now when he wakes sweating, panicked, Astoria is there to chase the monsters away. 10. He's made mistakes, and a lot of them. He knows that, he accepts that. He understands why, even now, people judge him for his name. For what he had done when he was younger. He accepts that some people hate him. But he's trying to change. He's trying to become a better person, for his wife, for his son, for his family. And isn't the fact that he's trying good enough? 1. She's never really felt that she fit in as well with the rest of her family. Now, it's not as if she's a complete misfit. She always enjoys herself when she's around her family, always laughs and regrets the moment when she has to leave. It's nearly impossible to not enjoy yourself when you're with her family. But sometimes, she feels as if she doesn't belong as well. Not that she's a puzzle piece that doesn't fit, exactly, just a puzzle piece that needed an extra push in order to fit. When the talk goes to Quidditch, or to flying, especially. It's not that she doesn't like her family, or her friends. It's just that sometimes the only place she can find the solace she needs is in books. So while they play Quidditch in the yard, she sits under the tree and reads. While they stress over their exams, she knows she did well, because she studied hard. Rose just feels that separates her from the rest of them. 2. She wasn't really scared when she was going to Hogwarts, mostly because she had heard so many stories from her cousins, her parents, her aunt and uncles, that she felt as if she belonged there, as if she had already been there. So she wasn't really scared of going to Hogwarts. She was a little apprehensive about leaving her parents for so long, but she wasn't going to admit that to anyone. So on the train ride, while Albus stressed and wondered, Rose just sat there and read. But then they were in the sorting. And suddenly, Rose wasn't as sure of herself. Despite the pleading, no one had ever told her how you were sorted. They had just smiled at her and told her she would find out eventually. All of them. Her mom and dad, Uncle Harry, Aunt Ginny, Teddy, Victoire, James, even her grandparents wouldn't tell her. James told her something about being tested about her magical power, but that couldn't be true. Even if Rose had read about all the spells, she couldn't do them, not in front of the whole school. And then she walked into the Great Hall and saw a hat. And she wanted to kill her family. A hat. But then the hat did the one thing she never ever forgave it for. It separated her and Al. 3. She was in Ravenclaw. She should have been happy. It proved she was smart, and maybe here was where she would find people she truly fit in with, people who loved to read as much as she did. Who recognized just how important school was. Here was where she would belong. But she didn't. She didn't mesh with her fellow Ravenclaws. Sure, she got along with a lot of them, but never did she form lasting, life-changing friendships with them. She was upset Hogwarts wasn't what she had thought it would be like. It wasn't as if she belonged there. She was beginning to wonder if she belonged anywhere. 4. And then Albus, who had felt just as alone, met Scorpius Malfoy. And for a while Rose was pretty jealous, because Albus spent all his time with Scorpius, and Rosie felt like she had lost the last friend she had. But then Albus decided to introduce Rose to Scorpius. And Rose just couldn't understand why her parents and her aunts and uncles all hated the Malfoy family so much. Because Scorpius was nothing less than a gentleman. Scorpius was kinda not very Slytherin-like at all, and Rose got along better with him than with any other Ravenclaw she knew. Scorpius swooped in and made Rose feel important. 5. She's always felt like she was responsible for taking care of everyone. Not just the younger ones, but all of them. She would scold Lily and Hugo for whatever it was they were doing. They seemed to be determined to follow in James's and Fred's footsteps, would yell at James and Fred for whatever it was they were doing, for both of them seemed determined to live up to their namesakes. She would make sure Molly and Lucy were acting innocent, would be a shoulder to cry on for Roxanne whenever she felt unloved, ugly, stupid, fat, hated, or whatever else it was that she was feeling. And would always keep an eye on Louis and Dominique, who always seemed to get themselves into awkward predicaments. The only people she didn't look out for were Teddy and Victoire, who were old enough to take care of themselves. And Albus, because he was a lot like Rose, and didn't get into too much trouble. Rose was like a substitute mother, acting years older than she actually was. But who was there to look after Rosé? That question was answered when one day, shortly after she realized she might be feeling something more than simply friendly feelings for Scorpius, Teddy walked by and asked her what was up. She knows he only asked to be polite, but suddenly she found herself spilling everything to him. He was kind of frozen in place, not used to be caught so unawares like that. But for some reason just telling someone was enough. She thanked Teddy and then ran off, knowing what it was she had to do. 6. When she got back to Hogwarts, going into 6th year, the first thing she did was run up to Scorpius and give him a big hug. He laughed and swayed a little bit, but then he wrapped his arms around her and hugged her back, before whispering, "I missed you too, Rosie," before planting a kiss on her head. And then, right in the middle of the whole crowd, in front of Albus and her cousins and everyone, she kissed him, hard, and it was when he started to kiss her back that she realized something. This was where she belonged. After searching for it for so long, for a sense of belonging, she had found it, there, in Scorpius' arms, with Scorpius. She regretted this action, of course. When she had to hunt down all of her cousins and anyone else who had any contact with her family and tell them, threaten was a more appropriate word, actually, that they were not to tell anybody, at all. And if they did, she would make sure they got detention until they left the castle for good. 7. She and Victoire are the only ones who didn't inherit the Weasley gene for flying. While Rose had inherited her mother's lack of gracefulness when she had anything less than 2 feet on the ground, Victoire was just plain clumsy, exhibiting a lack of gracefulness even with 2 feet on the ground. But Rose always hated the fact that she couldn't fly, that she was terrified of flying, especially when all her cousins went off to play Quidditch in the yard, and she was left sitting with the adults and Victoire. But then Scorpius was worrying so much about the upcoming game, the game for the cup, fretting and stressing and making such a big deal out of it that Rose just had to help, because she couldn't stand seeing him like that. So she got on a broom and did what he told her to, knowing she probably wasn't helping him much, what with the way she couldn't move without shrieking, "Oh!" or the way she nearly fainted the one fatal time she looked down. She faced a lot of crap for that, especially when Scorpius snatched the snitch right out from under James's nose. Her cousins all yelled at her. Even her dad wrote her and told her that she clearly didn't realize how important Quidditch was, and that under no circumstance was she allowed to help out the Slytherin team again. She had written him back and told him to shove it up his ass. She was grounded for ages for that. But she didn't care, because the way Scorpius looked at her after, that made it all okay. 8. Hugo and James. Albus and even Lily love hearing the stories about the war, about all the things their parents had done and how Uncle Harry had saved the world. He always denies this thoroughly, but it's obvious that without him, they might not have been there now. They revel in the play-by-play action of the battle, of the curses fired and the Death Eaters brought down, and the utter disbelief when they hear what Grandma Weasley did. No way. But Rose hates them. Because they scared her so much, the way death was always present, the way one wrong step would have killed her mother, her father, her aunts and uncles. She hates hearing about the way people were killed, the way her parents' friends were killed. It's the war's fault she never met her Uncle Fred, the war's fault Teddy has no parents, the war's fa. Old Uncle Bill has all those nasty scars on his face. She likes hearing about her parents' times at Hogwarts, more. The happier times, even though she understands they weren't completely happy. She likes hearing about all the stories about her mom and dad. Was her dad really that oblivious? She loves hearing about the way he was jealous of Victor Crumb. He denies it to this day. The way he went tea with Lavender Brown. He hates that story. The way her mom sent birds after him. She loves hearing about Uncle Harry and Aunt Ginny, the way she had been infatuated with him for years, and how he finally fell for her, too. She hates hearing stories about the war because they're violent, but the fact of the matter is Rose has always been a hopeless romantic, and that's why she likes the other stories more. 9. One of the scariest things of her life was telling her parents about her and Scorpius. Not because she was terrified that they would ban her from seeing him, but because she knew that if they did, she would have to defy them. Go against their word. And she had never done that. She was always the perfect child, the one who never got into any trouble, minus the whole shove it up your ass thing. The one who brought home nearly all outstandings in her OWLs while Hugo brought home, well, something quite less. But even though her mother gaped and her father, after a long silence, started shouting things Rose couldn't quite make out, they got over it. Her mother quickly closed her mouth and calmed down her father, and after a while they were all talking about it calmly. Her father was still completely opposed to the idea, but her mother, after a few long, awkward silences, asked her, "Is it serious, Rosie?" To which Rose nodded, and said, "I love him, Mum." That shut her dad up. And that made him finally nod and say, hoarsely, "Do what you wish." She had hugged them both, tightly, and then rushed off to write Scorpius. 10. She always felt like she worked harder than anyone, because she did. She studied harder, worked longer, staying up into the wee hours of the night to work on an assignment she had finished ages ago. School ran her life, and she thought her parents would be proud of that. But it was her mum who pulled her over one day, after her third year, just before she was going into her fourth, and told her that school wasn't necessarily everything. She told her that she was so very proud of all her achievements, but that sometimes it was okay to step back and let go, to have fun. When Rose told her stubbornly that she was having fun, Hermione gave her a long look and asked, "Really?" That was when Rose realized that it was her schoolwork that held her back, that maybe the reason she didn't have as many friends as everyone else was because she worked harder than even a Ravenclaw should. So when she went into her fourth year, she really did try hard to stop worrying so much, and to enjoy herself more. And she did. When he thinks about his childhood, he remembers George. Always George. George was there from the beginning, his best friend since before he was able to speak, to walk, to wave a wand. George saw it all and he's still there. George was there when he broke his arm. Or when he tried to cook and ended up nearly poisoning Charlie. George was the one to convince that the family would not be better off if Fred ran away, and George was there on that night before they left for Hogwarts, to comfort Fred as he tried to fathom what it would be like, leaving behind his family. George was there through it all, which makes Fred think that he should be there for George too. And for the most part, he was. He was there when George got lost in Diagon Alley, somehow realizing that of course he was at the ice cream shop, where else could he be? He was there when Auntie Muriel ripped into George about his jokes and called him names that had George crying for hours. He was there when George knocked over a whole shelf of animals, and helped him when the owner made him hunt down every single cat, rat and toad he had lost. But when he looked down at George, covered in blood with a gaping hole in the side of his head, Fred felt like he had failed. Because he should have been there, and he wasn't. 2. He feels the need to protect Ginny more than anyone. He knows she can look after herself, she's proved that many times. He should know that. Being on the receiving end of her bat bogey hex a number of times. But to him, she's always his baby sister, no matter how many Death Eaters she brings down. She'll always be his baby sister. No matter how many times she hexes Draco Malfoy. She'll always be his baby sister, the one who said his name first, out of all her brothers, when she was born. The one who came running to him, crying, whenever Ron did something mean. And even though he still pulled pranks on her, he always made sure they weren't too bad. While George always had a soft spot for Ron, Ginny is Fred's weakness, and he can't remember a time where he was more scared than when he found out she was in the chamber. In fact, that reason Fred didn't hex Harry when he found out they were dating wasn't because Harry was a family friend. It was because Harry had saved his little sister, and Fred would be eternally grateful to him for that. 3. He loved to pull pranks. He loved making people laugh, he loved getting revenge on those he didn't like. But the most important prank he and George ever pulled was with Umbridge. It wasn't just because they hated her but how they hated her. Fred has never felt so much hate in all his life. For anybody but because their prank gave life to the students. They made them feel like there was still hope, and maybe it made life a little bit more bearable, a little easier to get through. And if that's true, then Fred's okay with the fact that his mother grounded him and George for ages after that, even if they were of age. You try arguing that with Molly Weasley, it's like talking to a wall. He can't pinpoint an exact time when he and George decided they were going to open up a joke shop. All he knows is that one day, George came up to him with an idea: canary creams. After he explained them to Fred, he shouted, "This would be great for our joke shop." And Fred had nodded along, just as excited, before rushing upstairs to get all the scraps he had thought up of. For the joke shop they had never exactly decided to have. 5. He loved Angelina, because she was a good friend and she could always tell Fred and George apart. And when the Yule Ball came up, he began to notice that she was actually very pretty. So he asked her, because they were friends and she was pretty, and hey, maybe something more would come from that. He knew George had liked her briefly last year, but that was short-lived. And sure enough, his brother didn't care when he asked her to the ball with him. But after, when they were heading back to Gryffindor, and his feet hurt so much and they were laughing about God knows what, he realized that he didn't want to kiss her. He should want to kiss her, shouldn't he? I mean, they had had fun tonight, and he certainly liked being around her. But he knew that he didn't want to kiss her, and he actually dreaded the thought that he was going to have to kiss one of his closest friends, because that's what you did, at the end of the date. But as he was leaning in to kiss her, she quickly leaned away, before asking, "What are you doing?" "Well, I was going to kiss you." "And why the bloody hell were you going to do that?" Fred was relieved. "So you don't want to, either?" he asked, just in case. Angelina was a girl, after all, and from Fred's experience sometimes girls said the complete opposite of what they wanted. He could only hope Angelina wasn't playing that game. Of course not. That'd be awkward as hell. And he smiled and kissed her on the forehead instead, smiling as they both said goodnight and went their separate ways. And that was the end of that. 6. He loved Hogwarts, of course. Hogwarts was where he met his friends. Hogwarts was where he lived 10 months out of the years. He loved Hogwarts. But Fred didn't like being confined. He didn't like being forced to follow someone else's rules, not that he followed many rules, didn't like having a deadline for his homework, didn't like having to sit still in class. He loved Hogwarts. But he wanted to be out on his own, well, with George, of course, out living in the world, not confined inside the castle walls. So when he and George were finally living on their own, he figured he would be ecstatic. And yet he felt a little nostalgic, missed his mother and father and coming downstairs to the amazing smell of his mother's cooking. And, after eating out for the 5th time in a row, he knew George felt the same. So they went back home and reveled in their mother's cooking, taking home some recipes so that maybe they could cook themselves. After George burnt off his eyebrows and Fred had somehow burned a hole in the counter, however, the two somehow find themselves almost always conveniently close to the burrow whenever dinner time rolled around. 7. He was absolutely furious with Percy. Of course he was. Everyone was. Everyone except maybe his mom, who just cried all the time. He couldn't understand how Percy could be so stupid, so idiotic. How could he honestly believe that Dumbledore was wrong? That Harry was a fool. Dumbledore, who Percy used to idolize more than anyone. Harry, who had saved the lives of so many, in their family alone. How could he turn his back on his mother, who had done everything for them? How could he ignore his father, when they worked in the same bloody building? He was so angry at Percy he hated him, he didn't care that he was his brother. In Fred's mind, he wasn't his brother. Nobody who turned their back on the family should be considered a brother. 8. And yet when Percy came crawling back, Fred was the first to extend his hand. Because whether he was happy about it or not, whether he wanted to admit it or not, Percy was his brother. And if they turned their backs on Percy, weren't they all doing the same thing they had all hated Percy for doing? An eye for an eye, and all that. 9. He was terrified when Ron told them what was happening, that they had to use the ghoul, that he was leaving somewhere, but he couldn't tell them where he was going. Why he was going. And even though Fred had helped, if he knew a way to stop them, he would have. Because how was it possible that his little brother was going off into the unknown? How was it possible that innocent Hermione, who could be annoying as hell but who Fred still liked, was forced to hide because her parents were muggles? And how was it fair that Harry, a 17-year-old boy who had done nothing wrong, had the fate of the world on his shoulders? That was the only time Fred ever doubted Dumbledore, for he just knew it was Dumbledore who was behind this. How could it not be? When he sent 3 children to save the world. 10. He had a strange, gut feeling that somebody in the family wouldn't make it out alive. He knew it was terrible, but he just knew, somehow, that there was no way the Weasleys would be able to get out of this war unscathed. Yes, someone would die. He didn't want them to, but someone would die. His mum, maybe, to be. Why worrying about everyone else to think about herself? Or maybe Ginny, who tended to not be able to control herself once her anger got out of control. Or maybe George, but Fred couldn't think about that too much. How would he live without George? Still, he never thought that the one who would die would be him. Because how could he die? He hadn't even lived yet. And yet suddenly he was disoriented, didn't know where he was. And his one last thought was, no, not yet, before the light went out and he was engulfed by darkness. At first, his only memories were of yelling. All he could hear was yelling, everywhere he went. And it wouldn't go away, no matter how tightly he pressed his hands to his ears, no matter how many pillows he shoved his face under, no matter how far away he ran, the yelling was still there, following him. Haunting him. The yelling wouldn't go away. And then he saw her. The first time he ever saw her, she was with her whole family, leaving their house on Christmas Eve day. And her mother was holding tightly onto the hands of two little girls. The older one was wearing a blouse and a skirt, with angular features, and Severus was reminded of a horse. She was leaning away from her mother, trying unsuccessfully to get her hand free. The second, younger girl was the one who caught his attention. She had bright, red hair that tumbled over her shoulders, and was wearing a green velvety dress with white stockings on underneath. She was probably around his age, and she was laughing, a musical sound that made Sev want to laugh along with her. She wasn't pulling away from her mother's vice-like grip, instead leaning into her, and Severus knew there was something about her. There had to be. His first, happiest memory that stands out to him is when he discovered she was a witch. When he saw the way the flowers came to life when she touched them, the way she seemed to fly when she jumped off that swing. He knew she was a witch. She was like him. They would go away to Hogwarts together. They would be friends. Severus had never been more excited than when he realized that he and Lily Evans had something in common, that they could be friends. It didn't even matter that she was Muggle-born. Even if that went against everything he had been taught, it didn't matter. And they were friends. Severus had never had a friend before, had stayed away from most people. And most people had stayed away from him. But Lily was different. Lily didn't care about his clothes or his family. Lily was kind. Lily was gentle. Lily was a Gryffindor. No, that wasn't right. But as she walked over to the Gryffindor table, she gave him an apologetic look, sitting down amongst open arms and smiling faces, and Severus wanted to die. That was the beginning of the end, for nothing could ever happen between a Gryffindor and a Slytherin. 3. He hated James Potter and Sirius Black almost immediately. Because they were arrogant, thought they were better than everyone else, and even worse. People acted like they were, which did nothing but add to their big heads. He hated the way Black would take every opportunity to hex him, hated the way James Potter would play with the snitch. Hated the way he took every opportunity to ask Lily out. And even though he would never admit it to himself, he hated them because he could never be them, and he wanted to be them. Perhaps more than he really should. Later, he would hate them for stronger, more powerful reasons. He would hate Potter for the way he looked at her, and worse, for the way she looked at him. He would hate him more and more every time he touched her, every time they kissed, every time he would make her laugh. He hated him for having Lily, the one thing he had wanted more than anything, the one thing he could never have. And Black. He hated Black with the intensity of 1,000 burning suns, hated Black more than he hated anyone, even James Potter. He hated Black because Black had killed her. Black hadn't been able to see through Peter's poorly hidden betrayal. Black had handed her over. Black had killed Lily. 4. He regretted many things in his life. He had done many things he wasn't proud of, some small. And some that haunted him, caused him to toss and turn, trying to escape the nightmares. Even a pensieve couldn't take away the regret. But there was one thing he had done, one thing that didn't haunt him. It killed him. It was the beginning of the end of his life, the beginning of the darkness that constantly enveloped him, the cloud that always hung over his head, no matter how sunny the day was. It was that word, that awful, awful word he had sworn he would never mutter: Mudblood. But worse than that, he said it to her, to Lily, to the one person he had vowed never to hurt. He would have done anything to take that back, would have jumped in a pit of knives, would have walked on coals, would have given up magic, if he could just go back in time and change what he had said. But he couldn't. And the word hung in the air between them, Mudblood, and he knew he deserved it when she never forgave him. 5. He just knew that Lupin wasn't normal, and he was right. Lupin was a werewolf. Was Dumbledore mad, letting a werewolf into the school? Why, he could kill them all, or he could turn them all into werewolves, and then what would happen? What happened after? That was all a blur and he couldn't remember much. But the worst thing wasn't that he had almost died. The worst part wasn't the detention, or being sworn to secrecy, or any of it. The worst part was knowing that James Potter had saved him. And that now, he was indebted to Potter. 6. He should have known, really. Because people like James Potter always get what they want. They get everything. James Potter had money. He had Quidditch talent, he had the strange ability to not study at all and still get acceptable grades. James Potter had everything Severus didn't, but only one thing really mattered. James Potter had Lily. Of course he Lily. Why wouldn't he? He was smart, handsome, good at sports, and he wasn't dumb enough to give up the most important thing in his life to try and protect his damaged pride. Severus tried to convince himself that if he really loved her like he said he did, he would be happy with who she had chosen, he would be happy that she was happy. And she was happy. He could see it in the way her face lit up, the way she ran into his open arms. But he couldn't bring himself to accept that she was happy. All he knew was he hated James Potter more than anyone else in the world. 7. He was still slightly undecided. Despite what the rest of them said, despite Mulciber and Malfoy and everyone he associated himself with, he still didn't know if he was willing to surrender himself completely. To have the dark mark burned on his skin. He would have rather died than admit the reason why, that if she ever came back, if she left Potter and came back to him, she didn't accept him with that mark on his arm. So he stalled. He stalled until he heard the news, until he read that James Potter and Lily Evans had wed, and that was when he realized she wasn't coming back. That was when he gave himself to Voldemort, because without Lily, there was nothing left to lose. When he heard they had had a son, he paid little attention to the news, not wanting to reopen old scars he had long buried away. But then Voldemort told him he thought the prophecy referred to the little Potter boy, and told him, with no hesitations at all, of course not, that he would kill them all, James and Harry and Lily, his Lily. That was when he ran to Dumbledore. Because surely if anyone could save her, it would be Dumbledore. He never felt regret or betrayal for switching sides so easily, never felt like he had chosen wrong. Because there was no way he could stay on a side that would kill Lily Evans so easily. And he truly thought that with Dumbledore, Lily would be safe. But she wasn't. And that fateful Halloween night, Severus Snape felt his heart break for the final time. Because she was dead. She was dead. Dumbledore hadn't saved her. She was dead, 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 dead. 8. He hadn't planned to treat Harry differently than any other child. He knew he couldn't favor him, not with James Potter in him. Never could he love James Potter's son, even if part of him was Lily. He would treat just like any other student, not allowing the memories to resurface. But then he saw him, and he knew, without any doubt, that he was James. He was James Potter in every way, in his looks and his attitude, and the way he hated Severus, the way he thought himself better than everyone else. He hated him for being James, but he hated him much, much more for his eyes. Because how dare he have Lily's eyes? How dare he have a face and an attitude of James Potter, and the eyes of Lily, of his Lily, of the most kind, sweetest, caring person he had ever met. So he hated Harry, and he never felt any guilt about it except when he looked into Lily's eyes. 9. Killing Albus Dumbledore was the hardest thing he's ever had to do. He should have been prepared, he knows that, because he had had ages to prepare. And it could have been much, much worse. He's lucky the cards fell where they did, that Dumbledore was going to die anyway, because he knows that if he wasn't. But he never realized just how hard it was to stare into the kind blue eyes he had always took for granted, to be overwhelmed with memories of unconditional trust, of promises, of the man he had grown so close to. Even if he hadn't realized it until that moment. He couldn't kill Albus, couldn't kill the man who trusted him more than anyone, he couldn't kill him. But he had to, and he did. And he hated himself for it, for watching his body fall. For fleeing, for not being able to attend the funeral. He hated being in his spot, for making rules he didn't want to, for pretending that he was happy that he had killed him. That inside he wasn't grieving. He hated acting like headmaster, hated the way the students glared at him, hated the fact that he was doing all of this, and she was still dead, always dead. 10. He pleaded with Voldemort to let him go find Potter, because he had so much he needed to tell him, because how was he supposed to succeed unless Severus told him what he had to do? He knew, he just knew he was about to die. And there was nothing he could do. But then Potter was there, Potter took his memories, and it would be okay, even if he was dying, it would all be okay. But he needed one last thing. And he stared into Harry Potter's eyes and pretended they were hers, before the darkness that had engulfed his life was pushed aside by light, and he saw her again. 1. Everyone always thinks that she's perfect. Because she's a Weasley and she's part Vila. But she's not perfect, not even close. Sure, she's smart, but that wasn't really an accomplishment. Basically everyone in the family was smart. And yet even after she had proved time and time again that she was the last thing from perfect, they still just didn't get it. Even when she tried to play Quidditch and failed. When she tried to cook dinner and ended up poisoning her dad. When she broke her arm by tripping over the air. The only thing she could really do was speak French, and what good was that when she lived in England? Teddy was the only one who realized she wasn't perfect, the only one who recognized her flaws, the only one who teased her about them. It should have bothered her, but it didn't. Because it was Teddy. Teddy. Teddy had been her best friend since she was born, she was pretty sure. He says he can't remember much about her birth, except that she was small and wrinkly, and he's pretty sure he didn't like her much. Because he thought everyone would like her better. Victoire can't remember any of this, obviously, but the first memory she had included Teddy. She was about 4 and he was 6. And she had just seen something run up into a tree at the burrow, and she wanted to look at it. Teddy told her it was nothing, but she wanted to see what it was. So she grabbed his hand and ran off. By the time they got there, whatever it had been was long gone, but Victoire could remember that the whole time walking back, and sitting at the dinner table, they held hands. 3. She really loved going to France. Because it was so beautiful, and every year Maman would take them to the Eiffel Tower and let them stand on the top and look down. And even if Tante Gabrielle was really annoying, and her children were even more annoying, she still loved being there. And really, after Dominique punched Sophia, who was Victoire's age, they didn't really bother the Weasleys again. But even though she loved it, and even though she could speak French fluently, when her parents brought up the idea of her and her siblings going to Beauxbatons, she threw a temper tantrum. A real, honest-to-goodness tantrum, the only one in her life. She flailed her fists and screamed and got so angry she ended up breaking all the windows in the house by accident. She was probably about 9 then, and at that time, N.O.T. going to Hogwarts seemed like the worst thing possible. Because everyone was going to Hogwarts. Besides, England was her home. 4. But Hogwarts wasn't all she had thought it would be. Sure, she loved it. And she knew there was no way she would have enjoyed Beauxbatons more. But the first few months, when she was still just making friends and when Teddy ignored her, she wondered if she would ever feel like she belonged there. But then everything fell into place. She made some friends, Teddy talked to her again, and he once again claimed the best friend spot. Hogwarts was no longer intimidating, not as much, at least. But then again, everything looks better when you've got your friends behind you. 5. She should have guessed, she supposed. It was actually pretty obvious, to everybody except her. From the way he chose to hang out with her, even though she was 2 years younger, and he had his own friends. But it was more than that, even. It was the way he always sat close enough so they were touching. The way sometimes she would catch him staring, before both he and his hair blushed and he turned away. It was the way he would always hex the boys who broke her heart so badly they were in the hospital wing for days. If she had have looked a little harder, she would have seen that Teddy Lupin was crazy about her. But she was too busy worrying about her feelings. About how whenever he did touch her, that place would flare. While the rest of her body felt terribly cold in comparison. How she mocked him and made exasperating comments about how he was always around her, but how she loved it. How she wouldn't want it any other way. How whenever she caught him staring, it was usually because she was staring. And that even though she pretended she hated it when he hexed her exes, she didn't care. Because it meant that she could cry into his shoulder afterwards. And how about the fact that whenever she saw him with another girl, jealously flared, and she thought of a million and on rumors she could spread that would ruin her. She never actually spread any of the rumors, but if she heard one, she made no effort to try to stop it. It should have been painfully obvious, but it wasn't. 6. So it came as a big shock when he awkwardly told her how he felt. When she tried, and failed, to hold back the huge grin. When she told him how she felt, that she felt the same, he laughed. Before tentatively reaching down and kissing her. She, of course, kissed back, her hands running through his hair, which couldn't seem to find a color to stay on. They kept it secret for a while, afraid everyone would disapprove. Because they were like cousins, weren't they? As it was, George and Ginny got into a heated debate as to who should get the 3 galleons regarding the bet. George argues it should be him, as technically, They got together closer to his guess. Ginny says it's hers, because they told them closer to hers. Eventually, Hermione got tired of listening to them fight, and gave them both 3 galleons. 7. For a while, when she was young, she hated her birthday. Because everyone was always sad. When she was young, she didn't understand why, she just knew that there was never a celebration. That everyone was always sad, and lots of people cried. Victoire didn't understand that at all. Why were they crying? Certainly it wasn't for her birthday. Why would a birthday make you cry? At first, she hated it because it made people sad and she didn't understand. Then, she hated it because it was making people sad, and she did understand. Then, she hated her birthday because she understood what it meant. How much it reminded everyone of all those they had lost. She understood why Grandmom was often crying, why Uncle George got unusually quiet, why Uncle Harry usually secluded himself. She understood why everyone was sad, but it wasn't her fault. On her birthday, usually, she would just sit with Teddy while everyone mourned, waiting for it to be over. It never even seemed like her birthday. Later, though, it got better. When the immediate effects of the war were over, when those people they had lost were more memories than anything else. Her grandmom didn't cry, Uncle George would crack jokes. And Uncle Harry was always there, smiling and participating. But Victoire was still always sad, because she felt like that day should be a day to remember all those who had died fighting. Not to celebrate the birth of an awkward little girl. So even though everyone celebrated her birthday, she always wished they would do what they used to, so she could hide away with Tay. Ddy and try to escape the guilt she knew she shouldn't have. 8. Almost everyone in her family has red hair. Louis's is faded, slightly, but Dominique's was vibrant, and all of her cousins, except Albus, have the Weasley hair and freckles. She's the only one with long, blonde, Vila hair, like her mother. She always feels left out for it, and one time, at a Weasley family gathering, she asked Albus if he sometimes felt less Weasley-like because his hair wasn't red. He thought about it for a minute, then told her that it wasn't the hair that made you a Weasley. It was the smartest thing Victoire had ever heard. 9. Once word that she was dating Teddy Lupin got out, although how, she wasn't really sure. Lots of girls envied her, more than they already had. Everyone was always jealous of Victoire Weasley. She was beautiful, smart. But now she had Teddy Lupin, too, and even those who hadn't been in the school when he had been had heard of him. One time, when she was walking to Transfiguration, a 6th year named Rebecca Palmers asked her if she had snagged Teddy by using her Vila charm. It was the only time in her life she used the bat bogey hex her Aunt Ginny had taught her. 10. Lots of people figured her mother wasn't a very good witch, just because of her looks. After all, Fleur had even more Vila in her than Victoire was, and even Victoire got the feeling that people figured she was nothing more than just a pretty face. That was why Victoire respected her mother more than anyone else. Because yes, she was a pretty face. But she was so much more than that. She was a champion in the Triwizard Tournament. She turned her father into a goat when he thought she a year older than she actually was. And besides, she was the scariest woman Victoire knew. You never wanted to get on the wrong side of Maman. Victoire and Teddy often debated who would win in a fight, Fleur or Aunt Ginny. They have yet to come to a decision. 1. He had always told people that family was the most important thing. How it didn't matter how many awards you had, how many games you won, all that mattered was that you had someone to go home to love you. He told them all that nothing mattered more than family. And then he would sit in his room and cry and think about how much he was a fraud. He would think about his sister, his mother, his brother and father, think about all the mistakes he had made and how things could have been different if he had have known before that family was the most important thing. He always told people that love conquers all. How the light would prevail, because all those dark wizards, the ones who wanted to take over the world, they didn't have love. He told them all that love sweeps away the bad because love is pure, that Voldemort himself should be pitied because he couldn't love. He told them all that love would always win out over power, over hate, and then he would sit in his room and cry and think about how much he was a fraud. He would think about that boy whose name he hadn't spoken or thought of in years, about his crooked smile and the glint in his eyes and the way Albus felt when he touched him, how an accidental graze of skin had him flying. He would think about how love didn't sweep away the bad, how it egged it on, how it left Albus with no sense of judgment, with no ability to think for himself, because one smile from him, and he would go to the end of the earth for him. Love ruined him. 2. When he thinks about his father and what he had done, he knows that he can't hate him for it. He knows that, under the circumstance, Albus would have probably done the same, had he have been faced with it himself. He can't hate his father, and he knows that. But Albus has never forgiven his father, never forgiven him for leaving them broken, for expecting Albus to fix them. He can't forgive his father for leaving his mother to deal with what she had to, for leaving her to deal with Ariana. So he doesn't hate his father, but he just can't bring himself to forgive him. 3. His mother's death was terrible. It hurt Albus dearly, knowing his mother was dead, that he would never see her again. It was, essentially, the first death Albus had ever faced. And that made it even harder, the intense feeling of grief that weighed upon him everywhere he went. It hurt him in a way only a mother's death can, the pain, the feeling of loneliness, and the sense that his family was now broken beyond repair. But worse than that was that when he first heard of her death, for a second, he felt despair, not for his mother's death, but because everything was ruined now. It was only a second, and Albus regretted it later, how he regretted it. But it was still there, under the surface, lurking, and Albus couldn't fight it away. But in so many ways, Ariana's death was worse. Because Albus caused her death. Even though he was never certain who cast the spell, it was still his fault. Albus was responsible, as if he had taken a wand and purposely killed her. As if he had been meaning to, and looking at her lifeless body nearly drove him insane. 4. He was angry at Gellert, then. Of course he was. But he knew that he could never hate Gellert. He knew that even though Gellert had had a hand in his sister's death, he could never hate him, could never turn his back on him, and Albus hated that. He hated the fact that no matter what Gellert did, Albus would never be able to forget him. But Gellert was his best friend. Gellert was his anchor. Gellert made him believe that he could make something out of his life, that they could create a world where Ariana didn't have to hide. Albus had enough dignity to never see Gellert again, but deep down, he hated it. And that made him hate himself even more. He deserves the punch Aberforth gave him. He knows that. Even though people talked about it, spoke about how it was terrible that they should fight at their sister's funeral, Albus deserved it, and he's glad Aberforth did it. He knows. Aberforth was ruined because of Ariana's death, and Albus had caused it. He's surprised it was only a punch, and nothing more. 5. They all told him he was the only one who would be able to face Gellert Grindwald, to bring him down. He evaded that thought for ages, because he was certain he was the last man who would be able to do that. But eventually, he couldn't evade it any longer. People were dying, and Albus couldn't have that on his shoulders. He had to stop Gellert. He had to stop him because he knew, more than anyone, that that could have been Albus, up there beside him, killing and fighting for the greater good. It could have been Albus where Grindwald was, he could have been beside him, partners in crime, ruining the world for their own foolish beliefs. Albus hates to think anything good came from Ariana's death. But something did. Albus was shocked back to reality, out of the world of Gellert's smiles and the way his eyes would bore into Albus. Albus had to stop him. Becca. It was partially his fault. He had egged him on, he had been a part of these plans. But looking at him for the first time in so long, it hurt. Because he still could not see the man who was terrorizing the world. He still saw the boy who had charmed Albus more than anyone, who had laughed with him, who had become his best friend. He only saw the boy he had fallen for. And he couldn't kill him. He wasn't strong enough, couldn't do it. And Albus never forgave himself for that. Instead, he sent him away, to prison, sent him away for life, and lay in bed at night and thought about how his eyes didn't glint anymore. How his lips didn't twist into a crooked smile anymore, and Albus mourned for the boy he had known. 6. Hearing that Lily and James were dead, that was almost too much to bear. He simply could not believe that the laughing boy who caused too much trouble, the one who stared at Lily Evans far too much, was dead. He couldn't believe that the too serious girl with the red hair, the one who had nearly trashed his office when she found out James Potter was her fellow head, was dead. He couldn't believe it. He couldn't believe that Lily and James Potter were dead. He had known. He knew that they should have gone with Albus. He would have been safer, more trustworthy than Sirius Black. He couldn't believe it. Maybe that's why it didn't come as much Of a surprise to him when he finally learned the truth. Because there was absolutely no way Sirius Black had betrayed his best friends. 7. He truthfully hadn't meant to treat Harry any differently. He knew he would always feel a certain affection for him, but he was a professional. He could act like he was supposed to, not making allowances just because he was Lily and James's son, just because he was the boy who lived. But he couldn't help himself, because there was just something about Harry. At first, it was just because of all Albus knew, of the knowledge of what would have to happen in Harry's future. But then he got to know him, interact, and he saw that Harry was so much more than the boy who lived. He was the perfect mix of Lily and James. He was kind and gentle, he thought of others before himself. He valued friendship before all else, and he was brave, beyond anything. When Albus found out he had gone down to get the stone, he felt a surge of something that wasn't only worry, it was almost pride. Because he would be okay. Still, it wasn't until later, when he risked his life again and again to save the ones he loved, that he realized he loved him, much more than a student and teacher, like a son. 8. He didn't think he would be able to trust Severus. He wouldn't put people's lives into the hands of someone who may or may not be playing double agent. He agreed to see him. But he didn't think he would end up trusting him. But then he saw the pure anguish in his eyes. The pain. And he knew then, without a doubt, because you can't fake that. There was no way. People talked a lot about trusting Snape. They didn't think he deserved, still thought he was going to betray them all. He would never tell them the reason he trusted him. It wasn't his place to tell. But he knew that there was no way Severus Snape could go back to the man who had killed the woman he loved. 9. He could have gone down to see Aberforth. He knew where he was, knew he was so close to him. But he didn't. He could have gone down there and fixed everything, made amends, explained and made up with his brother, with the only family he had left. But he didn't, and he doesn't know why he didn't. But he just couldn't bring himself to walk down and pretend like everything was okay, like nothing ever happened. Because Albus killed Ariana and Aberforth never forgave him for that, and it was easier pretending he lost his whole family than to face rejection from his brother. Because at least, without knowing, he could pretend Aberforth lay in bed at night, thinking about visiting him. Sometimes it's just easier to pretend. 10. When Severus told him he had only a year to live, he didn't feel anything he should have. He didn't feel regret, or incomplete. He had lived, much more than others had lived. He had loved. Even after being broken, the only thing he regretted was the pain that would come to both Harry and Severus, after he was gone, but what could be done about that? He was happy with his life. Even with the hardships and the mistakes he had made. When he died, it wasn't even painful. The pain came from seeing the others mourn, see Severus do what he had to do, see Harry grow up so fast. He didn't care about his death, only about the others. That was how he was. Maybe love did conquer all, after all. 1. Yes, her dad is Harry Potter, the one who defeated the Dark Lord. Who accomplished more by the time he was 15 than most wizards do in a lifetime. Yes, her mum is Ginny Weasley, who had been one of the best players on the Holyhead Harpies. Yes, her aunt is Hermione Granger, one of the smartest witches at Hogwarts, and yes, her uncle is Ron Weasley, Harry Potter's best friend and a member of the Golden Trio. Yes, her uncle is him, and her aunt is her, and she's named after her and her. But what people always forget is that she is not Lily Evans, she is not Luna Lovegood, nor is she her mother or her father, her uncle or her aunt. She is Lily Luna Potter. She's tired of people comparing her to others, tired of being told stories, tired of people expecting her to follow in the footsteps of others. She is Lily Luna Potter, and she just wants to forge her own path. She loves her name. Don't get her wrong, she likes that she was named after people. But sometimes she wishes she was named something else, so people would have realistic expectations about her. 2. She loves her name, but still. The first time she passed by the memorial at Hogwarts and saw her name, she forgot that it wasn't about her, and she nearly broke down, right there. Lily Potter. But then she remembered that it wasn't her name, it was her grandmother's. But Lily was still upset, and she made sure that if she ever looked at the memorial again, she would purposely avoid the S. Pot where the names Lily Potter and James Potter were, because seeing her brother's name was disconcerting, as well. 3. The 2 years before she went off to Hogwarts and her brothers were gone were nearly impossible to endure. She would anxiously await their letters, or for the presents they had promised to send her, but that wasn't nearly enough. She wanted to be at Hogwarts. That was when she and Hugo became nearly inseparable. Because they were the ones left behind. They had always been close, but that was when they became best friends. So it really hurt when the hat put her in Hufflepuff, and Hugo in Gryffindor. Because she wasn't supposed to be separated from him. They were supposed to do everything together. They couldn't be in different houses. That would surely tear them apart. But it didn't. They were still as close as ever, even though they were in different houses. They were as close as Al and Rose, and they weren't in the same house either. That was when she learned that true friendships are hard to break, and it's even harder when it's family. 4. She loves her brothers, very much. She loves how they treat her like a girl, but how, at the same time, they always include her in their games. Let her play Quidditch with them, and even James always acknowledges her when they pass in the halls. But sometimes, having older brothers is just so annoying. Especially when you just know that Jacob Longbottom is going to ask you out, and James comes up and drags you away. Or when you're talking to Gabe Allen, and Albus, accidentally, slams into him. Brothers could be so infuriating. She talked to her mum about it, once. She told her that Albus and James were stupid and that they needed to realize that she was a big girl, she didn't need their help. Ginny had laughed. Eden told her that if she thought she had it bad, she should try growing up with 6 older brothers. After some of the stories her mum told her, Lily realized she didn't really have it that bad. 5. She was always good friends with Lorcan and Lysander Scamander, even though they were younger than her, and whenever somebody would make fun of them at Hogwarts, she would be the first one to jump to their defense. She was always closest to Lorcan, even though they are almost nothing alike. But that doesn't matter to Lily, because he's her friend, no matter what he likes to believe, no matter what stories he tells. With Lysander, she never really talked to him much, not as much as her brother, anyway. But then, she started to feel something change. When she was with Lysander, she felt something in her shift. As if the way he talked to her affected her whole body. And when he accidentally touched her, Lily felt her skin spark and she wished he would do it again. She was terrified of these feelings, because Lysander was her friend. And he was 2 years younger than him. But then, on the night of her graduation party, they sat together at the lake, and Lily was reminded of a story Teddy and Victoire had told them. About Teddy's graduation party, and she vaguely wondered whether that was going to happen to her and Lysander, when he suddenly pulled her face around and kissed her. 6. She's always been good at Quidditch. Because nearly everyone is good at Quidditch, except for Rose and Victoire. But everyone has always been better than her. She made her house team as a seeker, but James was always better. Whenever she played him, he would always get the snitch first, and whenever they played Slytherin, Scorpius would always get it. It wasn't that she was a bad player, it's just that they were so much better. But one game, when Lily was playing Gryffindor and zooming around looking for the snitch, Lily saw it, on the other end of the pitch. She flew towards it, expecting James to be right behind her to snatch it from under her nose, but when she chanced to look around she saw he was far away, flying at her with a wild look on his face. Lily was confused why had it taken him so long to realize. But as she grabbed the snitch and held it up, and the crowd cheered, she saw James flash her a big smile, and she understood immediately. She wishes he hadn't let her win like that. But at the same time she's pretty happy, because she was the hero for ages afterwards. 7. She's never really been the smartest, instead using a smile and batting her eyelashes to get what she wants. And maybe she's taken advantage of her famous parents, a little bit. And she always put off studying. Always. She just wasn't one to sit down and stuff her head in a book. Especially not in a place like Hogwarts. So, while even Hugo was studying, Lily just brushed it off, always using the excuse, exams are ages away, to get out of it. But then, suddenly, they weren't. They weren't ages away, they were right around the corner. Staring her down and laughing at her. And she was stressed. Her parents would kill her if she failed. It was Rose who stayed up with her all night, helping her study. He put aside her own studying to help Lily, and Lily knows that if it hadn't been for Rose, she would have failed everything. As it was, she got mostly E's, a few A's, and 1 O, in charms. She only got 1 failing mark. And that was in astronomy, but really, she didn't care much about that. She had always thought Rose was kind of stuck up. After that, she became one of her favorite cousins, after Hugo. 8. Her favorite uncle isn't Ron, or George, or Bill, like everybody else's. Her favorite uncle is Charlie. Not because he gives her presents, or because he tells her jokes, but because he acts like himself around her. With his brothers, he acts like they're all teenagers again, while with her mom, he acts like an overprotective older brother. With Grandma Weasley, he's constantly on guard, it seems. Ready to field any question she throws at him. But with Lily, it just seems like he doesn't pretend, like he just is. Lily loves him for that, for the fact that he can put that much trust in her, can be himself around her. 9. She loves her cousins, but sometimes she just needs to get away from all the red. She wouldn't change her family for anything in the world, and she knows she has it luckier than many. Hugo is her best friend, and her and Rose get along like sisters. James and Albus are too overprotective, but she loves them anyway, and even her older cousins, like Fred and Roxy and Lucy and Molly. She gets along great with that. Victoire acts like a mother to them all, and even Teddy, who they aren't related to, is like Lily's older brother. She loves them all, more than anything. But sometimes she needs to get away because there really are no secrets in her family. And if there are, they aren't kept for very long. Sometimes, she just needs to step away and spend time with her other friends. Like Jeff Longbottom or Ashley Sparks. But eventually, she'll get a little sick and tired of having to explain her thoughts, or of not being able to share inside jokes. That she goes and finds her cousins once again, because in the end, they are really her best friends. 10. There's something about care of magical creatures that made her take it all through Hogwarts. She was never planning on going into anything involved in magical creatures, but she just found the subject so very interesting, she couldn't stay away. It wasn't until one day in 5th year, when Hagrid ate some bad meat and was in the hospital wing for a day, that she realized it wasn't actually the subject she found so interesting. Sure, the animals were all really interesting. But the way the teacher explained it, it was just so dull. That was when she realized that it was Hagrid who kept calling to her. The way Hagrid really knew about the creatures, the way he seemed to have a special bond with all of them. The way he was still so nervous about teaching, even after all that time. It was a Hagrid she didn't get to see when she went to tea with him. It was a new Hagrid, and she loved him just as much as the old one. That's it for today, I will stop here. I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you please consider subscribe and make sure to hit that like button, share with your friends, and don't forget to check out author of this story. Details in description.